Get that child away from me. Do you have any idea who I am? The engines of the Boeing 787 were silent. Flight 3117 from Chicago to London wasn't going anywhere. Captain Thomas Richards had just informed the gate that he would not under any circumstances take this plane into the air. His ultimatum delivered to the passenger in seat 2C was simple. Apologize to the family she had just racially abused or be forcibly removed from his aircraft. 247 passengers were stuck on the tarmac and their frustration was building. Some were recording the confrontation on their phones. Others were already calling the airline's customer service line. A few were shouting for the captain to just fly the damn plane. But Captain Richards didn't care about their schedule. He thought he was doing the right thing. He had no idea that by standing up for a stranger, he was about to lose his job, his reputation, and his career that he'd built over 3 decades. And the person who filmed it all had a secret that would change everything. The boarding process for transatlantic Flight 3117 was proceeding with mundane efficiency. It was a cold, clear Tuesday night at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, and the 9 p.m. departure to London Heathrow was fully booked. Business travelers mixed with vacationing families, college students heading for study abroad, and the usual assortment of international travelers. In the cockpit, Captain Thomas Richards, a 30-year veteran of the airline, was running his final pre-flight checks with his first officer, James Wilson. At 50, Thomas was a pilot of the old-school firm fare, and with an unshakable belief that the captain's authority was absolute, designed not for ego, but for the safety and security of every soul on board. Checklist complete. Ground crew reports all clear. James murmured, his voice a relaxed monotone. Good, Thomas replied, scanning the instruments. Let's see if we can't get these people to London a few minutes early. Thomas had joined the airline after 12 distinguished years in the Air Force. He'd flown through sandstorms in the Gulf, navigated hostile airspace over the Balkans, and commanded squadrons with the precise balance of authority and respect that made him a natural leader. His record was spotless. Not a single violation or incident in his entire flying career. The terminal was bustling with the usual pre-holiday energy. Gate agents processed the final standby passengers, while ground crew loaded the last of the luggage. Thomas watched through the cockpit window, appreciating the choreographed efficiency of it all. James, I'm going to do my walk-through, Thomas said, unbuckling his harness. It wasn't required by airline policy, but Thomas always greeted the cabin crew and did a visual inspection before every flight. It was a habit from his military days that he'd never abandoned. Still doing that, huh? James smirked. At 38, he represented the newer generation of pilots, technically impeccable but sometimes lacking what Thomas considered the human touch of aviation. Always, Thomas replied with a smile. A machine can fly a plane. It takes a person to command it. The cabin was filling with passengers stowing their belongings and settling into their seats. Thomas nodded to the flight attendants, his presence both reassuring and professional. Sophia Rodriguez, the head flight attendant, gave him a quick update as he passed. Full flight, Captain. We're all set in the galley. Boarding should complete in about 15 minutes. Thank you, Sophia. Everything looks good. He paused. How's your son doing at college? Her face brightened. First semester finals coming up. He's nervous but prepared. This was what Thomas valued, the small human connections that transformed a crew into a team. He continued his walkthrough, nodding to passengers and crew alike. In Thomas's philosophy, safety wasn't just about mechanical checks and weather patterns. It was about creating an environment where every person felt secure, where dignity was as protected as physical well-being. It was an approach that had earned him the highest respect among his peers and crew. He returned to the cockpit, satisfied that his aircraft was ready, unaware that the most challenging test of his career was about to unfold. Dr. Elijah Jackson guided his 7-year-old daughter Lily through the narrow aisle of the aircraft, gently steering her past the first-class cabin. Almost there, Lily Bear. Just a few more rows. At 42, Elijah carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had overcome significant obstacles. As one of the leading pediatric cardiac surgeons in Chicago, he was relocating to London for a prestigious one-year fellowship at the Royal Children's Hospital, where he would pioneer a new microsurgical technique for infant heart defects. "Is that our seats, Daddy?" Lily pointed to row 10, the premium economy bulkhead seats they'd been assigned. "That's it. 10A and 10B. You can have the window if you'd like." Elijah smiled, watching his daughter's excitement. Lily clutched her worn plush elephant, Mr. Trunks, which had been her constant companion since his wife Sarah had passed away 3 years ago from breast cancer. Lily was nervous about the move, but trying to be brave. Elijah had prepared her as best he could, explaining that London would be an adventure, that she'd make new friends at her new school, and that they'd come back to visit Chicago during holidays. As they passed row 2, Lily, trying to peer into the first-class cabin with childlike curiosity, stumbled slightly. The small cup of apple juice in her hand tipped, and a tiny splash, no more than a teaspoon, landed on the pristine white designer shoe of the woman in seat 2C. "Disgusting," the woman shrieked, recoiling as if she'd been struck. She yanked her foot back, her face contorting in outrage. Elijah was mortified. "I am so sorry, ma'am." Lily apologized to the lady. "I'm sorry," Lily whispered, her eyes welling with tears as she clutched Mr. Trunks tighter against her chest. The woman in 2C was Vanessa Blackwell, and everything about her exuded wealth and entitlement. Her blonde hair was pulled into an immaculate chignon, her cream-colored cashmere tracksuit likely cost more than the average passenger's entire wardrobe, and her fingers sparkled with diamonds that caught the cabin lights with every dismissive wave of her hand. Elijah grabbed a napkin from his pocket and knelt down. "Please let me get that for you. It's just apple juice." "Get away from me," Vanessa snapped, her voice rising in volume. She looked at Elijah, then at Lily, and her face twisted into a mask of pure contempt. "You people can't even control your children. This is what happens when they lower the standards for who gets to fly up front." Absolutely disgraceful. The "you people" hung in the air, thick and toxic. Elijah, who was black, froze. His hand, holding the napkin, stopped mid-air. He stood up slowly, his expression shifting from apologetic to a cold, controlled quiet. "Ma'am," Elijah said, his voice low. "It was an accident. There is no need for that kind of language." "Oh, that kind of language?" Vanessa mocked him, her voice now loud enough for the entire first class and half of premium economy to hear. "I call it as I see it. This cabin is for paying customers, not for your kind. Bringing your mess and your noise." Several passengers looked up from their pre-flight routines, sensing the tension. A middle-aged man in 4A frowned, shaking his head slightly at Vanessa's behavior. Flight attendant Vanessa called out loudly, snapping her fingers. Sophia Rodriguez rushed over, sensing the confrontation. "Is there a problem? Mom?" "Yes, there's a problem." Vanessa pointed a long manicured finger at Elijah and Lily. "This person assaulted me with his sticky mess. I am not going to sit here for 8 hours breathing the same air as them. I want them moved. Move them to the back of the plane where they belong." The cabin fell silent. Other passengers were now staring, phones emerging from pockets and bags. Lily burst into tears, a high, terrified wail. Elijah picked his daughter up, holding her tight, trying to shield her from the humiliation. He looked at Sophia with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "We are assigned to seats 10A and 10B. We are not moving. You will move if I tell you to." Vanessa shrieked. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Sophia, hopelessly out of her depth, touched her earpiece. "Captain Richards," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I think you need to come to the main cabin. We have a situation." Vanessa Blackwell's face flushed crimson as she continued her tirade, her voice cutting through the previously calm atmosphere of the cabin. "I am not sitting anywhere near these people. Do you understand? My husband can have your job with a single phone call. Passengers in nearby rows shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some averted their eyes, pretending to be absorbed in magazines or phones, while others stared openly, their expressions ranging from disgust to morbid fascination. Cameron Foster, a 29-year-old tech specialist in seat 14C, had already begun recording discreetly on his phone. His eyes narrowed as he captured Vanessa's increasingly vitriolic language. What no one on the plane knew was that Cameron recognized the name Blackwell immediately. Until 6 months ago, he had worked in IT security for Blackwell Enterprises, and what he had discovered there was the reason he no longer did. "It's barely a drop," said an elderly woman from across the aisle. The child apologized. "Let it go." Vanessa whipped around. "Mind your own business. You have no idea who you're speaking to." Elijah Jackson stood perfectly still, one hand stroking his daughter's hair as she buried her face against his shoulder, her small body shaking with sobs. His expression was a carefully composed mask that those who experience racial aggressions learn to wear, a mixture of dignity and restraint that requires monumental effort to maintain. "Lily," he whispered to his daughter. "It's okay, baby. You didn't do anything wrong." Sofia Rodriguez looked between the two parties, her professional training at war with her personal sense of justice. "Mom, I can bring you some club soda for your shoe. It will come right out." Club soda. Are you joking? These are limited edition Louboutins. They're ruined. Vanessa thrust her foot forward as evidence, though the small spot was barely visible. A businessman in first class spoke up. "Lady, they're just shoes." The kid said sorry. "Just shoes." "They cost more than your suit," Vanessa shot back. Then she turned to Sofia again. "I want to speak to your supervisor immediately. And I want these people moved away from me, preferably off this flight entirely. The coded language wasn't lost on anyone. These people hung in the air like poison." Elijah's patience was visibly fraying. "My daughter and I have done nothing wrong. The only disruption here is coming from you." Vanessa's laugh was sharp and cruel. "Nothing wrong. You shouldn't even be in this section. Did you get some kind of special upgrade? Affirmative action at 30,000 feet. Gasps emerged from several passengers. A young woman in row 5 covered her mouth in shock. Another passenger muttered, "That's enough, loud enough for those nearby to hear." Sophia's hand trembled as she touched her earpiece again. "Captain, we need you in the main cabin immediately." Lily's sobbing had intensified, her small body shaking against her father's chest. "I want to go home, Daddy," she cried. "I don't like the mean lady." Elijah's eyes flashed with a mixture of pain and fury. "It's okay, Lily. The mean lady can't hurt you. I won't let her." "Oh, look at that," Vanessa sneered, teaching her to play the victim already. Sophia stepped between them, her professional demeanor cracking under the pressure. "Ma'am, please lower your voice. There are other passengers." "Don't tell me what to do," Vanessa interrupted. "My husband is Richard Blackwell. He sits on the board of this airline. I'll have your job by morning if you don't fix this situation right now." The threat landed with the intended effect. Sophia's face paled slightly, but she held her ground. "I've called the captain. He'll be here momentarily." Cameron Foster continued recording, his jaw tight with tension. He had first-hand experience of what the Blackwell name could do, how it could crush careers and lives. 6 months ago, he had discovered irregularities in the company's financial systems, clear evidence of fraud that he'd reported through proper channels. 2 days later, he'd been terminated, escorted from the building by security, and threatened with legal action if he spoke to anyone. His employment record had been tarnished with false claims of incompetence. Now, watching Vanessa Blackwell's behavior, he felt a cold sense of validation. The corruption he'd witnessed in the company was perfectly mirrored in her entitled cruelty. "I don't care who your husband is," Elijah said quietly. "My daughter and I have valid tickets for these seats. We're not moving because you're uncomfortable with the color of our skin." "How dare you accuse me of—" Vanessa began, but she was interrupted by the appearance of Captain Thomas Richards emerging from the cockpit. His presence immediately changed the dynamic in the cabin. His uniform crisp, his bearing straight, he exuded calm authority as he assessed the situation. Captain Thomas Richards emerged from the cockpit and immediately sensed the shift in atmosphere. The air was no longer filled with the mundane bustle of boarding. It was sharp, brittle, and charged with tension. All eyes were on two people: Vanessa Blackwell standing in the aisle with her face contorted in rage, and Dr. Elijah Jackson holding his sobbing daughter, his own face a mask of dignified fury. Thomas sized up the situation in seconds. He was the son of a steel worker and had been an Air Force pilot before joining the commercial lines. He had zero tolerance for two things: threats to his aircraft and bullies. "Good evening," Thomas said, his voice calm and carrying the natural authority of a commander. "I'm Captain Richards." "What seems to be the trouble here?" Vanessa immediately turned her venom on him. This passenger she spat, gesturing at Elijah and his child, were careless and disgusting. "He spilled something on me, and now he refuses to move. I demand you move them to economy to the back." Thomas looked at the floor. He saw the tiny damp spot on the carpet, smaller than a quarter. He saw the toe of Vanessa's sneaker, which was already drying. Then he looked at Elijah Jackson, who was trying to comfort his daughter. Sir Thomas said, addressing Elijah first. "What happened?" Captain Elijah said, his voice strained but respectful. "My daughter stumbled. A drop of her apple juice spilled. I apologized and offered to clean it. This woman then began screaming about you people and demanding we be moved to the back of the plane. She said we didn't belong here." Thomas's eyes hardened. He turned to Vanessa Blackwell. His voice was still calm, but the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. "Ma'am, is that true?" "Did you use that language?" Vanessa scoffed, crossing her arms. "I said what I said. This is first class. I paid for a first-class experience, not to be surrounded by that. I am a Platinum Elite member, and I am telling you to fix this now." "Ma'am, a spilled drop of juice is not a reason to move a passenger," Thomas said. "It is when I say it is," Vanessa retorted. "I am Vanessa Blackwell. My husband is Richard Blackwell. Does that name mean anything to you? He sits on the board of this airline. I can have you fired. I can have this entire crew fired. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Captain, remove them." The threat was clear. The name Richard Blackwell did in fact ring a bell. He was a corporate raider, a titan of finance. And yes, Thomas was vaguely aware he was on the board. He saw Sophia, the flight attendant, go pale. He saw his first officer, James, poke his head out of the cockpit, his expression alarmed. Thomas took a deep breath. He looked at Lily, who was still crying softly into her father's shoulder. He saw Elijah's eyes, proud, angry, and also resigned, as if this was a scene he had experienced too many times before. In that moment, something crystallized in Thomas Richards. A lifetime of discipline, of doing things by the book, of respecting chain of command, collided with a deeper, more fundamental principle. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, his voice level but firm, "on my aircraft, safety comes first, and that includes the dignity and safety of every passenger. Dr. Jackson and his daughter have valid tickets for their seats. They have done nothing wrong. I will not be moving them." Vanessa's eyes widened. "Excuse me, did you not hear me? Do you know what my husband will do when he—" Thomas held up a hand, cutting her off. "What I know, ma'am, is that on this aircraft, I am the final authority, and I've determined that the only disruption to the safety of this flight is coming from you. How dare you? I'll have your job for this." "That's your prerogative," Thomas said calmly. "But right now you have a choice to make. You can apologize to Dr. Jackson and his daughter and take your seat, or you can be removed from this flight." The cabin went completely silent. Even Lily had stopped crying, sensing the shift in power. Vanessa looked around, expecting to find support, but was met with averted gazes or outright disapproval. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice lower but still venomous. "You're choosing them over me. Do you have any idea what Richard will do to your career?" Thomas didn't flinch. "I'm not choosing anyone over anyone, Mrs. Blackwell. I'm enforcing the standards of conduct that apply equally to every passenger. And right now, you're the only one in violation of those standards." Vanessa pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Richard right now. You'll be lucky to work as a crop duster when he's finished with you." As she dialed, Thomas turned to Sophia. "Please inform the gate that we have a non-compliant passenger who may need to be removed." Sophia hesitated for just a moment, then nodded and moved toward the galley phone. Vanessa's voice rose as she spoke into her phone. "Richard, you won't believe what's happening. Some power-tripping pilot is threatening to throw me off the flight because I complained about these people who spilled their drink on me." Thomas waited patiently. In the background, he could see Cameron Foster still recording discreetly, and several other passengers had their phones out as well. This would be on social media within minutes, he realized. "He wants to talk to you," Vanessa said triumphantly, holding out the phone. "My husband wants to speak with you, Captain." Thomas took the phone. "This is Captain Thomas Richards." The voice on the other end was cold and precise. "Captain, this is Richard Blackwell. I understand there's some confusion about my wife's comfort on your flight." "No confusion, sir. Your wife used racially charged language toward another passenger and his child over a minor accident. She's been asked to apologize or deplane. Listen carefully, Richards. I sit on the board of your airline. I can make one phone call and end your career tonight. Now, whatever my wife said, I'm sure it was misinterpreted. Be smart about this. Move the other passengers, smooth things over, and get that plane in the air." Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. "Mr. Blackwell, with all due respect, I don't take orders from board members when I'm in command of an aircraft. Your wife has a choice to make. The consequences of her choice are hers alone." He handed the phone back to Vanessa, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "This is your final opportunity, Mrs. Blackwell," Thomas said. "Apologize to Dr. Jackson and his daughter, or you will be escorted off this aircraft." Vanessa looked at the phone, then at Thomas, then at Elijah and Lily. For a moment it seemed like she might relent. Then her face hardened again. "I will not apologize for expecting proper service. You're making a terrible mistake, Captain Richards. When this is over, you won't just lose your job. You'll never work in this industry again." Thomas nodded once his decision made. "Sophia, please inform the gate we need security to escort a passenger off the aircraft." He turned to the rest of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We'll be airborne as soon as possible." As Sophia made the call, Thomas noticed First Officer James staring at him from the cockpit doorway, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear. Their eyes met, and in that look Thomas knew that the consequences of his decision were just beginning to unfold. Thomas Richards returned to the cockpit with the cabin buzzing behind him. James Wilson was already seated, his face tight with concern. "Are you out of your mind?" James hissed. "That's Richard Blackwell's wife. He owns half the airline's stock." Thomas didn't respond immediately. He sat in his captain's chair and stared out at the dark tarmac, the distant lights of other aircraft moving across the field. After 30 years of flying, he had never faced a situation quite like this. "I need a minute," he said to James, standing up again. "Take over pre-flight." "Thomas, listen to me," James said, his voice urgent. "Call the gate. Tell them there's been a misunderstanding. Let Sophia handle it. You don't have to be the one to die on this hill." "I said I need a minute." Thomas repeated his tone, leaving no room for argument. He walked to the lavatory and closed the door behind him. In the small, confined space, he gripped the edge of the sink and stared at his reflection in the mirror. His uniform was impeccable as always, the 4 stripes on his shoulders representing decades of disciplined training and adherence to protocol. What was protocol now? The airline manual covered disruptive passengers, but this was more complex. A board member's wife, racial harassment, a child in tears, a father trying to maintain his dignity. Thomas splashed cold water on his face and remembered another confrontation years ago when his son Michael was 14. They had been at a high-end department store shopping for a suit for a school function. A security guard had followed them throughout the store, watching their every move with suspicious eyes. When Thomas had confronted him, the guard had claimed it was standard procedure. But Thomas knew better. He knew what it meant to be seen as inherently suspicious because of your skin color. He remembered how his son's shoulders had slumped, how the light in his eyes had dimmed. Later that night, Michael had asked him, "Dad, does it ever stop?" Thomas hadn't had a good answer then. Now, in a different context, the same question echoed. Does it ever stop? Not if good people remain silent, he realized. Another memory surfaced his time in the Air Force flying through hostile territory. The rule had been clear. You protect your people no matter what. Not just physically, but in every way that mattered. It was what made a unit cohesive, what transformed a group of individuals into a team that could accomplish the impossible. That little girl out there crying in her father's arms, wasn't she under his protection too? Every passenger on this aircraft was regardless of where they sat, what they looked like, or who they knew. Thomas dried his face and straightened his uniform. When he returned to the cockpit, James was on the radio with ground control, his voice tense. "They're asking how long until we're ready to push back," James said. "Security is on their way to remove Mrs. Blackwell." "Good," Thomas said, taking his seat. "We'll be ready once they're finished." James lowered his voice. "Thomas, I've got a mortgage and 2 kids in college. I can't afford to be caught in the crossfire of whatever you're doing." Thomas turned to look directly at his first officer. "James, sometimes in life you have to decide what kind of man you want to be. I made that decision a long time ago." "It's not worth your career," James insisted. "Some things are worth more than a career," Thomas replied. "Some principles don't have a price tag." James shook his head. "The company won't see it that way. They'll see a captain who unnecessarily delayed a flight and embarrassed a board member. They'll see a liability, not a hero." "I'm not trying to be a hero," Thomas said. "I'm just trying to do what's right." Outside the cockpit window, Thomas could see gate agents making their way down the jetway. The moment of truth was approaching. In his 30 years of flying, he had faced mechanical failures, terrible weather, and even a medical emergency that had forced an ocean diversion. But he had never faced a threat to his career like this. Was he really willing to risk everything? The pension he had worked towards for decades, the identity he had built as a pilot, the stability that supported his family. James was still watching him, waiting for him to waver. "It's not too late," James said. "One word from you and this all goes away. Mrs. Blackwell gets an apology, the other passengers get moved, we take off, and everyone forgets this by morning." Thomas felt a strange calm settle over him. Except that little girl. She won't forget, and neither will her father. And neither would I. He picked up the intercom microphone, his decision made. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing he had acted according to his deepest principles. Captain Richards's voice resonated throughout the cabin as he addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I apologize for the delay in our departure. We're dealing with a situation that requires resolution before we can proceed. I ask for your patience and understanding." He replaced the microphone and stepped out of the cockpit again. Security personnel had arrived, 2 uniformed officers standing at the front of the cabin conferring with Sophia. Vanessa Blackwell remained in the aisle, phone in hand, her face a mask of indignation. As Thomas approached, conversations hushed. Passengers who had been complaining about the delay fell silent, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Mrs. Blackwell Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him respect throughout his career. "Security is here to escort you off the aircraft if necessary." "This is outrageous," Vanessa sputtered. "You can't do this. Actually, I can, and I will. Federal aviation regulations give me complete authority over this aircraft and everyone on it. You've disrupted this flight with inappropriate and racially charged behavior toward Dr. Jackson and his daughter. I was just—" "You have two choices," Thomas interrupted, his voice level but firm. "You can apologize sincerely to Dr. Jackson and his daughter and take your seat quietly for the remainder of the flight, or you can deplane now. Those are your only options." The ultimatum hung in the air. Passengers watched with a mixture of fascination and discomfort as Vanessa's face cycled through emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally a calculating coldness. "Do you know what my husband will do to you?" she asked, her voice lower now. Thomas didn't flinch. "In this aircraft, I don't command just altitude and speed. I'm responsible for the dignity of every soul on board. That's not negotiable, regardless of who your husband is." The statement resonated through the cabin. A few passengers nodded in approval. Cameron Foster, still recording, felt a surge of respect for the captain's unwavering stance. Vanessa's phone rang and she answered it immediately. "Richard." "Yes, they're really doing this. There are security guards here to remove me from the plane." She listened for a moment, then thrust the phone toward Thomas. "He wants to talk to you. Again." Thomas took the phone. "Mr. Blackwell, this is Captain Richards." Richard Blackwell's voice was controlled but menacing. "Captain, you're making a career-ending mistake. My wife is upset, and you're escalating a simple misunderstanding into an international incident. Be reasonable. I can make one call to the CEO right now. Sir, with all due respect, this isn't about who knows whom. This is about basic human dignity and the safety of my aircraft. Your wife used racially charged language toward another passenger and his child. She has been given the opportunity to apologize and remain on the flight. The choice is hers." "Listen carefully, Richards. I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you. Fix this situation to my wife's satisfaction, or I will personally ensure that you never sit in a captain's chair again." "Is that clear?" Thomas paused, aware of the dozens of eyes watching him, the phones recording the moment, crystallizing into a decision that would define the rest of his career. "Mr. Blackwell, what's clear is that on my aircraft, everyone is treated with equal respect. No exceptions. No special treatment. Your wife can apologize and stay, or she can leave. Those remain her only options." He handed the phone back to Vanessa, whose expression had shifted from anger to shock that her husband's intervention hadn't immediately resolved the situation in her favor. "This is your final opportunity, Mrs. Blackwell," Thomas said. "What will it be?" Vanessa looked at the security officers, then at the passengers watching the scene unfold. She seemed to be calculating her options, perhaps realizing for the first time that her usual tactics weren't working. "This is ridiculous," she said finally. "I'm not apologizing for expecting proper service and behavior. I'll be on the next flight and you'll be looking for a new job." Thomas nodded to the security officers. "Please escort Mrs. Blackwell off the aircraft." As the officers moved forward, Vanessa gathered her designer handbag and cashmere wrap. "You'll regret this, all of you," she said, her gaze sweeping the cabin. "My husband will hear about every person who was involved in this humiliation." Thomas stood firm, his posture military straight as Vanessa was escorted toward the exit. Before she left, she turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Captain. Not by a long shot." As she disappeared down the jetway, a strange silence fell over the cabin. Then, unexpectedly, a smattering of applause broke out. It wasn't universal. Some passengers looked concerned about the delay or the confrontation they'd witnessed, but enough people clapped to create a moment of solidarity. Thomas turned to find Elijah Jackson standing nearby, his daughter Lily still in his arms, though she had stopped crying and was watching with wide, uncertain eyes. "Thank you," Captain Elijah said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Sir Thomas replied. "And I would do it again." As he turned to head back to the cockpit, Thomas caught sight of James watching from the doorway. His first officer's expression was a mixture of disbelief and fear. "You realize what you've just done?" James asked as Thomas approached. "I've upheld the standards I swore to maintain," Thomas answered. "Now let's get these people to London." But as he settled back into his seat, Thomas was acutely aware that the consequences of his decision were only beginning to unfold. He had just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men associated with the airline perhaps in the entire industry. The realization didn't fill him with regret, but with a strange sense of clarity. Some lines once drawn cannot be uncrossed. First Officer James Wilson's fingers drummed nervously against the control panel as Thomas slid back into the captain's seat. Outside, the ground crew was preparing for pushback now that the Blackwell situation had been resolved, at least temporarily. "You've lost your mind," James said, his voice low and tense. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Thomas began his pre-flight checklist again, his movements precise and methodical. "I've enforced the standards of conduct on my aircraft. Nothing more, nothing less. You've just kicked a board member's wife off the plane. And for what? A drop of juice. A few harsh words. Was that really worth torching your career?" Thomas paused, fixing James with a steady gaze. "It wasn't about the juice, James. You know that as well as I do. It was about a woman who thought her wealth and connections entitled her to degrade another human being, to humiliate a child. Where exactly would you have drawn the line?" James looked away, unable to meet Thomas's eyes. "I'm not saying she was right. I'm saying there were other ways to handle it. Ways that wouldn't have made an enemy of Richard Blackwell. Such as, you could have moved the Jacksons to first class, upgraded them. Everyone would have been happy." Thomas shook his head. "And what lesson would that have taught that little girl? That when someone treats you as less than human, you should just accept it and move away. That if you're powerful enough, you can get away with anything." James's radio crackled with air traffic control instructions providing a momentary reprieve from the tension. After acknowledging the transmission, he turned back to Thomas. "The ultimate sin in my cockpit isn't a mistake," Thomas said quietly. "It's silence in the face of what we know is wrong. My father taught me that. My commanders in the Air Force reinforced it. And I've lived by it for 50 years. Noble principles don't pay mortgages," James muttered. "No, but they let you sleep at night." Thomas completed his checklist and prepared for pushback. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in James's demeanor, a pulling away, a distancing. His first officer was already separating himself from Thomas's decision, already preparing his defense for when the inevitable fallout came. Through the cabin intercom, Thomas addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richards. We're cleared for departure and should be taking off momentarily. Our estimated flying time to London Heathrow is 7 hours and 40 minutes. We'll be making up some time en route and should arrive only slightly behind schedule. Flight attendants, please prepare for departure." The familiar routine of takeoff preparations created a semblance of normality, but Thomas was acutely aware that nothing about this flight was normal anymore. He had just defied one of the most powerful men connected to the airline. There would be consequences. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Thomas caught a glimpse of Sophia Rodriguez moving through the cabin. She gave him a small, nearly imperceptible nod as she passed the cockpit door, a tiny gesture of solidarity that nonetheless strengthened his resolve. The engines roared to life and the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. From his vantage point, Thomas could see Dr. Jackson and Lily in their seats. The little girl was looking out the window now, her earlier tears forgotten as she watched the airport lights glide past. Her father sat beside her, his hand protectively on her shoulder. James remained unusually quiet during the taxi and takeoff sequence, performing his duties flawlessly, but speaking only when necessary for operational communications. The weight of unspoken tension filled the cockpit. Once they had reached cruising altitude and the aircraft was stable, James finally broke his silence. "What's your end game here, Thomas Blackwell will be on the phone with the CEO before we're halfway across the Atlantic. You'll be met by HR when we land in London. Best case scenario, you're suspended pending investigation. Worst case, you're terminated on the spot." Thomas adjusted a setting on the autopilot, his movements calm and deliberate. "I've been flying for 30 years, James. I've done everything by the book. Perfect record, perfect evaluations. If they want to fire me for refusing to allow racial harassment on my aircraft, then maybe it's not the airline I thought it was. It's not about right and wrong anymore. It's about power. And Blackwell has it. Power doesn't make him right. No, but it makes him dangerous." James paused, then added, "I can't be pulled down with you on this, Thomas. I've got too much at stake." The statement hung in the air between them, a declaration of self-preservation that Thomas had been expecting, but that nonetheless stung. "I understand," Thomas said finally. "When they ask, tell them you advised me against it. Tell them you tried to get me to reconsider. I won't contradict you." James nodded, relief evident in his expression. "For what it's worth, I don't think what she did was right. I just think some battles aren't worth fighting. And I think some battles define who we are," Thomas replied, "even if we lose them." The rest of the flight proceeded with tense professionalism between the two pilots. Thomas knew that every minute that passed brought him closer not just to London, but to the reckoning that awaited him there. Richard Blackwell would have had hours to mobilize his considerable influence by the time they landed. Somewhere over the Atlantic, as James took a break and Thomas sat alone in the cockpit, he allowed himself a moment of doubt. He thought of his mortgage, his daughter's graduate school tuition, the retirement he and his wife had planned, all potentially jeopardized by a single decision. But then he remembered Lily's tears, the humiliation in Elijah's eyes, and the poison in Vanessa Blackwell's words. No, he hadn't made a mistake. Whatever came next, he would face it knowing he had stayed true to himself and to the values he had spent a lifetime upholding. The navigation display showed the aircraft making steady progress across the ocean. In 7 hours, they would land in London, and Thomas Richards would discover exactly what his principles had cost him. Gate agents and security personnel boarded the aircraft, their expressions serious and professional. Vanessa Blackwell, still standing in the aisle, clutched her designer handbag like a shield, her knuckles white with tension. "Mrs. Blackwell, please gather your belongings and come with us," one of the security officers said, his voice calm but firm. "This is a mistake," Vanessa insisted, her voice rising. "Do you know who I am? My husband will have all your jobs." The security officer remained impassive. "Mom, we're just doing our job. The captain has final authority on this aircraft, and he has determined that you need to deplane. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Passengers watched the scene with a mixture of discomfort and fascination. Some were visibly annoyed by the delay, checking watches and sighing impatiently. Others seemed relieved that action was being taken against Vanessa's behavior. "I am not leaving this aircraft," Vanessa declared, crossing her arms. "You'll have to drag me off, and I promise you that will be the last thing any of you do in this industry." The lead security officer exchanged glances with his colleague, then spoke into his radio. "We have a non-compliant passenger refusing to deplane, requesting additional assistance." Thomas Richards stood at the cockpit doorway, watching the situation unfold. His face remained composed, but there was a steel in his gaze that betrayed the gravity of the moment. This was no longer just about one passenger's behavior. It had escalated into a direct challenge to his authority as captain. Sophia Rodriguez approached Vanessa one last time. "Mrs. Blackwell, please reconsider. You're only making things worse for yourself." Vanessa laughed bitterly. "Worse for myself? You have no idea what worse looks like. When Richard is finished with all of you, you'll be lucky to find work directing traffic in a parking lot." 2 additional security personnel arrived, one of them a supervisor based on his uniform. He assessed the situation quickly, then addressed Vanessa directly. "Mrs. Blackwell, you have 2 options at this point. You can walk off this aircraft voluntarily, or we will be forced to remove you physically. I strongly recommend the first option." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Vanessa's face. The reality of her situation seemed to be dawning on her, that her husband's name and her status might not be enough to prevent her removal from the flight. "This is assault," she said, her voice slightly less confident. "If you put your hands on me, I'll sue all of you." "No one wants to put hands on you, Mom," the supervisor replied patiently. "But the captain has given lawful instruction for your removal, and we are authorized to carry that out." Vanessa looked around the cabin, perhaps hoping for support from other first-class passengers, but was met with averted gazes or outright disapproval. "Fine," she finally said, gathering her belongings. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot. My husband sits on the board of this airline. By the time I'm finished, none of you will have jobs." As she moved toward the exit, she stopped beside Dr. Jackson and Lily. The little girl shrank back in her seat, pressing closer to her father. "I hope you're happy," Vanessa spat. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts." Elijah Jackson met her gaze steadily. "This isn't about victory, Mrs. Blackwell. It's about basic human dignity, something money can't buy." Vanessa's face flushed with anger, but the security personnel gently guided her forward, preventing any further confrontation. As she disappeared down the jet bridge, a palpable release of tension swept through the cabin. Several passengers applauded, though the response wasn't universal. Some still seemed annoyed by the delay, while others appeared uncomfortable with the entire situation. Thomas Richards stepped further into the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly. I appreciate your patience and understanding." An elderly man in first class spoke up. "Captain, you did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you different." Thomas nodded in acknowledgement, then made his way to where Dr. Jackson and Lily were seated. The little girl was calmer now, though her eyes were still red from crying. "Dr. Jackson, I want to personally apologize for what you and your daughter experienced today," Thomas said quietly. "That's not what our airline stands for." Elijah extended his hand. "Thank you, Captain. Most people would have taken the easier path. What you did means more than you know, especially to her." He nodded toward Lily. Thomas crouched down to be at eye level with Lily. "Hello there. I'm Captain Richards." "What's your name, Lily?" she answered shyly, still clutching her stuffed elephant. "Well, Lily, I want you to know that you didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes adults behave badly, but that's never your fault." "Okay." Lily nodded solemnly. "Are you going to get in trouble?" The question, so innocent yet so perceptive, caught Thomas off guard. He glanced up at Elijah, then back to Lily. "Don't you worry about that. My job is to make sure everyone on this plane is safe and treated with respect. That's all I did." But as he returned to the cockpit to prepare for departure, Thomas couldn't help but wonder the same thing. Would he get in trouble? Richard Blackwell's influence was considerable, and Thomas had just very publicly removed his wife from a flight. James Wilson was already in his seat, running through pre-flight checks again. His expression was grim. "That was quite a show," he said as Thomas settled in. "I hope it was worth it." "It wasn't a show, James. It was the right thing to do." "The right thing might cost you everything," James replied, not looking up from the instrument panel. "Some things are worth the cost." As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate nearly 90 minutes behind schedule, Thomas caught sight of Cameron Foster through the cockpit doorway. The young man was looking directly at him, nodding slightly in what seemed like respect or approval. Thomas nodded back, unaware that this brief exchange was with someone who understood the Blackwells better than most and who had captured the entire incident on video. The engines roared to life, and Flight 3117 began its taxi toward the runway. Thomas focused on the familiar procedures, the comforting routine of takeoff preparations. But beneath the professional calm, a thought kept circling. Had he just ended his career? As the aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted into the night sky, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions. The exhilaration of flight that never grew old, coupled with the sobering knowledge that this particular journey might be his last as a captain. Whatever came next, he had stayed true to his principles. That would have to be enough. The wheels of Flight 317 touched down at London Heathrow at 10:42 a.m. local time, the Boeing 787 gleaming under the pale English sunlight. Thomas guided the aircraft to its designated gate with the same precision he'd demonstrated throughout his 30-year career. If this was to be his last landing as captain, at least it was a perfect one. As the engines spooled down, Thomas completed his shutdown checklist with methodical care. James had been unusually quiet during the descent and landing, speaking only when operational necessity demanded it. "Nice landing," James said finally, almost reluctantly. "Thank you," Thomas replied, signing the flight log. Through the cockpit window he could see something unusual, a group of people waiting on the jet bridge. Not gate agents or ground crew, but men in suits. His heart sank. He recognized the airline's London-based HR director among them. "Looks like your welcoming committee has arrived," James observed, nodding toward the window. "So it seems." The cabin intercom chimed and Sophia's voice came through. "Captain Richards, there are airline representatives requesting to speak with you immediately upon deplaning." "Thank you, Sophia. I'll be right there." Thomas stood straightening his uniform jacket out of habit. Before he could exit the cockpit, James spoke again. "Thomas, I want you to know." He hesitated, then shook his head. "Never mind. Good luck." Thomas studied his first officer for a moment, recognizing the conflict in the younger man's eyes. "Take care of yourself, James," he said simply, then stepped into the cabin. The passengers were still collecting their belongings, preparing to deplane. As Thomas made his way down the aisle, several people nodded to him respectfully. An older gentleman reached out to shake his hand. "Well done, Captain. Don't see that kind of backbone much these days." Thomas nodded in acknowledgement and continued forward at row 10, Doctor. Jackson was helping Lily with her backpack. Their eyes met, and Elijah gave him a solemn nod, understanding passing between them without words. At the aircraft door, Sophia stood with the other flight attendants. "They've been waiting since before we landed," she whispered. "Mr. Blackwell must have made those calls mid-flight." "I expected as much," Thomas replied. "Thank you for your support, Sophia." "What you did was right, Captain." Her voice wavered slightly. Not everyone would have had the courage. Thomas stepped onto the jet bridge where 4 men in suits waited. He recognized Walter Pearson, the airline's European HR director, and Charles Dawkins, the London station manager. The other 2 were unfamiliar. Captain Richards Pearson said, his tone formal. "I'm afraid I need to collect your credentials and access badges immediately. You've been placed on administrative suspension pending investigation." Thomas had anticipated this, but the reality still stung. Without a word, he unpinned his captain's wings and removed the airline ID badge from his jacket. As he handed them over, he noticed Dawkins couldn't quite meet his eyes. "Is there anything you'd like to say for the preliminary report?" Pearson asked. "My actions on Flight 317 were in accordance with my authority as captain and my responsibility to maintain a safe and respectful environment for all passengers," Thomas stated evenly. "I stand by my decision. You refused a direct request from a board member." One of the unfamiliar men said, his voice cold. "You publicly humiliated his wife." "I refuse to allow racial harassment on my aircraft," Thomas corrected him. The fact that it came from a board member's wife is irrelevant to my duties as captain. Pearson cleared his throat uncomfortably. A car is waiting to take you to the crew hotel. You're to remain there until further notice. Your return flight has been reassigned. A disciplinary hearing will be scheduled within 48 hours. Thomas nodded. Is that all? For now? Pearson hesitated, then added in a lower voice. This is coming from the very top, Richards. Blackwell has the CEO's ear, and he's out for blood. As Thomas was escorted through the terminal, he noticed people staring. Some were colleagues, other pilots, and flight attendants who watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to discomfort to outright avoidance. News traveled fast in the airline world. Near the exit, he was surprised to find Cameron Foster waiting. The young man approached him cautiously. Captain Richards, I was on the flight. I recorded what happened. Thomas looked at him warily. More evidence for the airline's case against me. No, sir. The exact opposite. I uploaded the videos while we were in the air. They're already getting traction online. People need to see what really happened, not whatever spin Blackwell puts on it. Before Thomas could respond, one of his escorts stepped between them. Captain Richards is not authorized to speak about the incident. Please step aside. Cameron backed away, but called after them. People are on your side. Captain, the truth will come out. In the car headed to the crew hotel, Thomas finally checked his phone, which had been off during the flight. It was flooded with notifications, text messages from colleagues, voicemails from numbers he didn't recognize, and dozens of social media alerts. One text from his wife Helen stood out. It's all over the news, Thomas. Richard Blackwell is on morning television calling for your termination. Call me when you land. I love you, and I'm proud of you. That last sentence gave him a measure of comfort as the gravity of his situation continued to sink in. After 3 decades of unblemished service, his career was hanging by a thread because he'd refused to allow a wealthy passenger to degrade another human being. As the London streets passed by outside the car window, Thomas wondered if he would ever sit in a captain's chair again. The cost of his principles was becoming painfully clear. 1 week later, Thomas Richards sat stiffly in a sterile conference room at the airline's London administrative offices. Across from him, 3 members of the disciplinary committee studied him with expressions ranging from neutral to openly hostile. A digital recorder sat in the center of the table, documenting every word. Walter Pearson from HR presided over the hearing, flanked by Operations Director Marianne Cooper and Chief Pilot Douglas Thornton. Behind them, separated by a glass partition in an observation room, sat Richard Blackwell himself, his expensive suit and cold stare designed to intimidate. Thomas had refused the airline's suggestion that he bring a union representative. This wasn't about contracts or regulations. It was about right and wrong. He would stand on his own. This disciplinary hearing is now in session, Pearson began formally. Captain Thomas Richards, you've been called to answer charges of insubordination, violation of customer service protocols, and willful disruption of airline operations resulting in financial loss. How do you plead? Thomas met Pearson's gaze evenly. I acted within my authority as captain to ensure the safety and dignity of all passengers on my aircraft. Marianne Cooper sighed, making a note on her tablet. Captain Richards, we're not disputing your technical authority. We're questioning your judgment. A simple customer service issue was escalated unnecessarily, resulting in the removal of a high-profile passenger, a significant departure delay, and substantial public relations damage to the airline. With respect, Ms. Cooper, it was not a simple customer service issue, Thomas replied. It was a case of overt racial harassment directed at a passenger and his child. Douglas Thornton, a former pilot himself, leaned forward. Let's be clear about something, Richards. There are ways to handle difficult passengers without creating an international incident. You chose the nuclear option. From his jacket pocket, Thomas withdrew a printed copy of the airline's own passenger code of conduct. Section 3, paragraph 2, states explicitly that discriminatory or abusive language or behavior toward other passengers or crew will not be tolerated and may result in removal from the aircraft. I enforced the airline's own policy. You enforced it against the wife of a board member, Pearson pointed out. Surely you could have found a less confrontational solution. Should board members and their families be exempt from the rules that apply to everyone else? Thomas asked. The question hung in the air uncomfortably. Through the glass, Thomas could see Richard Blackwell's expression darken. Let's move on, Pearson said hastily. We'll hear testimony from your first officer, James Wilson. James entered the room, avoiding eye contact with Thomas as he took a seat at the table. He looked nervous, his uniform slightly rumpled. First Officer Wilson Pearson began, "Please describe the events on Flight 3117 from your perspective." James cleared his throat. Captain Richards was called to the cabin to address a dispute between passengers. When he returned to the cockpit, he informed me that he intended to have Mrs. Blackwell removed from the flight. Did you express any concerns about this decision? Pearson prompted. I did, James said, still not looking at Thomas. I advised him that it seemed like an overreaction to what was essentially a minor altercation. I suggested alternative solutions such as relocating the affected passengers or offering them an upgrade. And how did Captain Richards respond to your advice? James shifted uncomfortably. He dismissed my concerns. He said it wasn't about the spilled drink, but about the principle. I felt he was fixated on making a point regardless of the consequences to the airline or the other passengers. Thomas remained impassive, though the selective retelling of their conversation stung. James was protecting himself as expected, but the distortion of events was more pronounced than Thomas had anticipated. Thank you, First Officer Wilson, Pearson said. You may go. As James left, he finally glanced at Thomas, guilt flashing briefly across his face before he hurried from the room. Next came Sophia Rodriguez, who entered with her head held high. Unlike James, she looked directly at Thomas, giving him a small nod. Ms. Rodriguez Pearson began as lead flight attendant on Flight 317. Did you feel Captain Richards's decision to remove Mrs. Blackwell was justified? Sophia hesitated, visibly weighing her words. I witnessed Mrs. Blackwell use language toward Dr. Jackson and his daughter that was clearly inappropriate and racially motivated. She referred to them as you people and suggested they didn't belong in premium seating. And could this situation have been resolved without removing Mrs. Blackwell? Sophia's expression remained professional, but Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders. Mrs. Blackwell was given multiple opportunities to apologize for her behavior. She refused. She escalated the situation by threatening the captain and crew with termination. In my professional opinion, Captain Richards followed proper protocol. Thomas noted the surprised glances between the committee members. They hadn't expected Sophia to support him so unequivocally, especially with Richard Blackwell watching. Are you aware that your assessment directly contradicts that of First Officer Wilson Marianne Cooper? Asked sharply. I can only speak to what I personally witnessed in the cabin, Ma'am Sophia replied. First Officer Wilson remained in the cockpit during most of the incident. When Sophia was dismissed, Thomas could feel the mood in the room shifting. His testimony had created doubt, complicating what was supposed to be a straightforward termination. Captain Richards Pearson said, Finally, do you have anything else to add before we deliberate? Thomas straightened in his chair. In 30 years of flying, I've never violated protocol or shirked my responsibilities as captain. I've made decisions that saved lives during mechanical failures and medical emergencies. I've diverted flights when necessary and delivered passengers safely through severe weather. Not once has my judgment been questioned. He paused, glancing briefly at Richard Blackwell through the glass. The moment my judgment is called into question is when I stand up against racial harassment. That should tell you everything you need to know about this proceeding. Pearson's expression tightened. You're dismissed, Captain. We'll inform you of our decision. As Thomas left the conference room, he passed Richard Blackwell entering from the observation area. Their eyes met briefly, and Blackwell's expression was coldly triumphant. "You should have known better," Richards Blackwell said quietly. "No principle is worth your career." "Some are," Thomas replied simply and continued walking. 2 hours later, Thomas received the committee's verdict in his hotel room: immediate termination for failure to follow company protocol and exercise appropriate judgment. His 3 decades of service were reduced to a single paragraph of corporate language that carefully avoided any mention of the actual incident's nature. As he placed the termination letter on the hotel desk, Thomas felt a strange mix of emotions: regret at the loss of the career he'd loved, but also a profound sense of peace. He had stayed true to himself at a moment when it mattered most. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. "They're trying to bury this, but people know the truth. Stay strong, Captain." Thomas looked out the hotel window at the London skyline, wondering what came next. At 50, starting over wouldn't be easy. But he'd faced tougher challenges and survived. Whatever happened, he would never regret standing up for what was right. Cameron Foster's apartment in London was modest, a far cry from the sleek corporate offices of Blackwell Enterprises where he'd worked until 6 months ago. Hunched over his laptop, he monitored the explosive growth of the videos he'd posted. 5 million views and climbing, he murmured to himself, scrolling through the comments. The footage he'd captured on Flight 3117 had struck a chord, spreading across social media platforms with remarkable speed. His phone rang another news outlet requesting permission to use his footage. This was the 5th call today. "Yes, you can use it," he told the producer. "Just make sure you mention that Captain Richards was fired for standing up against racist behavior." When he hung up, Cameron leaned back in his chair, thinking about the strange twist of fate that had put him on that particular flight. 6 months ago, he had been a rising star in Blackwell's IT security department until he discovered irregularities in the company's financial records, clear evidence of fraud and market manipulation. When he'd reported it through proper channels, he'd been terminated within 48 hours, his reputation smeared and threatened with legal action if he spoke out. Now, watching the Blackwell's true colors exposed to the world, he felt a grim satisfaction. The universe had a way of coming full circle. On his screen, a news segment played Airline Controversy Hero Captain or Protocol Violator. The split screen showed Thomas Richards' official airline portrait alongside footage from the flight. Below, a ticker displayed social media reactions most supporting the captain. Cameron had done his part by uploading the unedited footage. Now it was taking on a life of its own. Across the Atlantic in his Chicago home, Thomas Richards was experiencing the surreal sensation of seeing himself at the center of a media firestorm. His wife Helen sat beside him on the couch, her hand squeezing his as they watched yet another news segment about the incident. "Airlines are facing increasing pressure to address the incident publicly," the news anchor was saying. The hashtag #Harai Captain Richards has been trending for 3 days with over 1 million users expressing support for the terminated pilot. "Turn it off," Thomas said quietly. "I've seen enough." Helen clicked off the television. The airline's PR team must be in meltdown. Their statement was pathetic, all that corporate doublespeak about investigating the incident when they've already fired you. "They're in a difficult position," Thomas acknowledged. "Blackwell essentially forced their hand. That doesn't make it right." Helen's voice was tight with anger. 30 years of perfect service and they threw you away because some rich bigot's feelings got hurt." The doorbell rang, interrupting their conversation. Thomas opened the door to find a courier with an express package. "Thomas Richards." "Sign here, please." Inside the package was a brief letter from a civil rights attorney named Grace Mendoza, along with her business card. "Your stand against discrimination has resonated with many," the letter read. "If you're interested in discussing legal options regarding your termination, I would be honored to represent you." "What happened on that flight matters," and how the airline responded matters even more. As Thomas considered the offer, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was Dr. Elijah Jackson, Captain Richards. "I've just learned about your termination. I can't express how sorry I am that standing up for my daughter and me has cost you your career. If there's anything I can do. Testimony statements to the press, please let me know. What you did meant more than you know. Lily still talks about the brave pilot." Thomas felt a lump in his throat as he showed the message to Helen. "You should respond," she said gently, "and you should call that attorney." Meanwhile, in his expansive London hospital office, Dr. Elijah Jackson watched his daughter Lily coloring at a small table he'd set up for her. The drawing showed an airplane with a figure in the cockpit wearing a captain's hat. Below it, in a child's uneven lettering, were the words, "Captain Richards, Hero." Elijah's phone chimed with a news alert, another development in the story that had consumed much of his attention since their arrival in London. The headline read, "Blackwell Enterprises stock drops amid viral video controversy." He'd been wrestling with guilt since learning of Thomas's termination. The captain had sacrificed his career to defend Elijah and Lily's dignity, and that was a debt Elijah wasn't sure how to repay. His new colleagues at the Royal Children's Hospital had been supportive, especially after the video went viral. Several had approached him to express their admiration for how he'd handled the situation and their disgust at Vanessa Blackwell's behavior. "Daddy, is Captain Richards in trouble because of us?" Lily asked, looking up from her drawing. Elijah moved to sit beside her. "No, sweetheart. Captain Richards is in trouble because some people don't understand that doing the right thing is always more important than doing the easy thing. Can we send him my picture? I think he'd like that very much," Elijah said, taking a photo of the drawing to send to Thomas. In New York, Richard Blackwell paced his penthouse office phone pressed to his ear. "I don't care what the public reaction is," he snapped. "The board needs to stand firm on this." Richards violated protocol and embarrassed a board member's family. His termination is non-negotiable. His assistant entered hesitantly, tablet in hand. "Sir, there's something you should see." On the screen was a financial news report. Blackwell Enterprises faces scrutiny as viral incident raises questions about corporate culture. Richard's face darkened. "Get my PR team on the line. Now." The fallout was spreading beyond just Thomas Richards and the airline. Investors were raising questions about Richard Blackwell's judgment and temperament. Some were even drawing connections to long-standing rumors about the company's business practices. What had begun as a simple confrontation on an aircraft was evolving into something much larger, a symbol of power, privilege, and accountability that resonated far beyond the original incident. As the week progressed, public opinion continued to shift overwhelmingly in Thomas's favor. Airline employees began speaking out anonymously, describing a culture of special treatment for VIPs that often violated the company's own stated policies. Former colleagues of Thomas came forward to attest to his character and professionalism. And in a small London apartment, Cameron Foster continued to monitor the situation, wondering if now might be the time to reveal what he really knew about Blackwell Enterprises information that went far beyond a single incident of arrogance and entitlement on an airplane. The truth, as he had discovered, was much darker and had the potential to bring down not just Richard Blackwell's reputation, but his entire empire. Judge Elena Vasquez removed her reading glasses and rubbed her eyes, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her office in the late evening hours. At 62, she had seen enough of the world to know that coincidences were rarely just coincidences. The video playing on her screen showed a confrontation on an aircraft, a passenger being abusive, a captain intervening, a clear case of racial harassment. What had caught her attention wasn't the incident itself, but the name of the passenger, Vanessa Blackwell, wife of Richard Blackwell. As the presiding judge in an ongoing federal investigation into financial fraud allegations against several major corporations, including Blackwell Enterprises, Elena found the timing remarkable. For months, prosecutors had been building a case against Richard Blackwell, gathering evidence of insider trading, market manipulation, and fraudulent financial reporting. But Blackwell was notoriously careful, insulating himself behind layers of subordinates and shell companies. Now this very public meltdown by his wife had thrust the Blackwell name into the spotlight, creating exactly the kind of scrutiny Richard had always worked to avoid. Elena picked up her secure phone and dialed a number. "Martin, it's Judge Vasquez. Have you seen the video of Richard Blackwell's wife on that flight?" She listened for a moment. "Yes. I think it's relevant to our case. This could be the pressure point we've been looking for. People are seeing the Blackwells for who they really are." In his Chicago apartment, Thomas Richards was reviewing legal documents with attorney Grace Mendoza. The wrongful termination suit they were preparing had gained unexpected momentum as public support for Thomas continued to grow. "The airline's position is weakening," Grace explained, highlighting a section of the draft complaint. "Their internal policies clearly support your actions, and they know it. Plus, we've been contacted by 3 passengers from the flight who are willing to testify on your behalf." Thomas nodded, though his expression remained somber. "I appreciate all this, but I'm not sure a lawsuit is the right approach. I don't want money. I just want my reputation cleared." "It's not just about money," Grace insisted. "It's about accountability. The airline needs to acknowledge that they fired you for enforcing their own anti-discrimination policies. That matters not just for you, but for every employee who might face a similar situation in the future." Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from Sofia Rodriguez. "Check the news now." He grabbed the remote and turned on the television. Breaking news banners flashed across the screen. "Exclusive, former Blackwell IT specialist reveals evidence of corporate fraud." The camera showed Cameron Foster, the young passenger from Flight 3117, who had recorded the incident, now sitting across from a national news anchor. "6 months ago, I discovered evidence of systematic fraud at Blackwell Enterprises," Cameron was saying. "When I reported it internally, I was fired and threatened with legal action. The incident on that flight shows the true character of the Blackwells. They believe rules don't apply to them, whether it's how they treat other people or how they conduct their business." Thomas and Grace watched in stunned silence as Cameron methodically outlined what he had discovered: manipulated financial statements, offshore accounts, insider trading, and market manipulation schemes that had potentially defrauded investors of billions. "This goes way beyond one incident on an airplane," Cameron continued. "Richard Blackwell has built an empire on intimidation, corruption, and the belief that wealth puts him above accountability. Captain Richards stood up to that mentality, and it cost him his career. But the truth can't stay hidden forever." The news anchor turned to the camera. "We should note that Blackwell Enterprises has denied these allegations in a statement, calling them the fabrications of a disgruntled former employee. However, multiple sources have confirmed that federal investigators have been looking into the company's practices for some time." Grace turned to Thomas, her expression transformed. "This changes everything. Your case is now part of something much bigger." Meanwhile, in London, Dr. Elijah Jackson watched the same broadcast, his daughter Lily asleep in the next room. The revelation that the Blackwells were potentially involved in massive fraud added a new dimension to what had happened on that flight. His phone rang, a Chicago area code. "Dr. Jackson. This is Grace Mendoza. Captain Richards' attorney. I believe we have a shared interest in seeing justice done." Across the Atlantic, Richard Blackwell was in crisis mode, surrounded by lawyers and PR consultants in his Manhattan office. The television on the wall showed Cameron Foster's interview on continuous loop, each repetition, another nail in the coffin of Blackwell's carefully constructed public image. "How did this happen?" he demanded, slamming his fist on the conference table. "Who cleared Foster's termination 6 months ago? I want names." His general counsel looked uncomfortable. "Sir, we should focus on the immediate legal exposure. The SEC has already contacted us requesting additional documentation, and there are rumors of a grand jury being convened. Richard's face was ashen beneath his tan. This is all because of that pilot. If he had just done what he was told, none of this would be happening. With respect, Mr. Blackwell, his PR director, interjected. The public is overwhelmingly against us on this. Your wife's behavior on that flight, followed by your aggressive response in having Captain Richards fired, has created a narrative we can't easily counter. People see it as a clear abuse of power. Richard stared at him coldly. So we're supposed to just surrender? Let some self-righteous pilot and a vindictive IT specialist destroy everything I've built? What we're saying, sir, is that we need to change tactics. The aggressive approach has backfired. We need to consider damage control options, including possibly a settlement with Richards and a public statement expressing regret for the incident. Absolutely not, Richard snapped. I don't apologize. I don't back down. That's how I built this company, and that's how I'll protect it. What Richard Blackwell didn't realize was that his refusal to back down was exactly what Judge Elena Vasquez had been counting on. As she signed the warrants authorizing a comprehensive search of Blackwell Enterprises records, she reflected on the strange chain of events that had led to this moment. A drop of apple juice on an expensive shoe, a captain who refused to look the other way, a young IT specialist with evidence of fraud, and a powerful man whose arrogance had finally caught up with him. Sometimes justice found its path through the most unexpected channels. Judge Elena Vasquez sat in her chambers reviewing the latest reports from the SEC investigation into Blackwell Enterprises. What had begun as a routine financial fraud case had expanded dramatically in the wake of Cameron Foster's public revelations. Now federal investigators were uncovering layers of corruption that extended far beyond what even they had initially suspected. The flight incident was the thread that unraveled everything, remarked Assistant U.S. Attorney Daniel Martinez, seated across from her desk. Once people started looking closely at Blackwell, they couldn't look away. Elena nodded, tapping a document on her desk. This is remarkable. Foster's testimony opened the floodgates. We now have 3 other former Blackwell employees coming forward with corroborating evidence. And the airline situation has become a perfect storm for him, Daniel added. The wrongful termination lawsuit from Captain Richards is generating daily headlines, keeping Blackwell in the public eye in the worst possible way. Have you seen the passenger testimonies? Elena asked. 7 people from that flight have now provided sworn statements about what happened. The consistency is striking. Daniel checked his notes. What's even more interesting is what we found when we started looking into other discrimination complaints involving Blackwell properties and businesses. There's a pattern of similar incidents being covered up. Complaints buried settlements with strict NDAs. A lifetime of behavior coming home to roost, Elena observed. And all because one man refused to look the other way. Across town, Cameron Foster was meeting with federal investigators for the 3rd time that week. Having finally broken his silence, he was now providing detailed information about the financial irregularities he had discovered while working at Blackwell Enterprises. The system was designed to be impenetrable, Cameron explained, pointing to complex diagrams on the conference room screen. Multiple shell companies' offshore accounts manipulated transactions that would be difficult to trace without knowing exactly what to look for. And how did you discover it? Asked the lead investigator. I was implementing a new security protocol for their financial systems. During the integration testing, I kept encountering discrepancies that didn't make sense. When I dug deeper, I found evidence of fraud going back at least 7 years. Why didn't you report it to authorities immediately? Cameron's expression darkened. I made the mistake of following company protocol, reported it to my supervisor, then to compliance. 2 days later, I was terminated for performance issues and escorted out by security. Then came the threats, legal action, career destruction, the works. They made it very clear what would happen if I spoke up. What changed? Why come forward now? seeing Captain Richards stand up to the Blackwells, watching him lose his career for doing the right thing. It put things in perspective. If he could sacrifice everything on principle, how could I stay silent? Meanwhile, in Chicago, Thomas Richards was meeting with Grace Mendoza in her downtown office, reviewing developments in their case against the airline. The situation has evolved beyond what any of us anticipated, Grace explained, spreading documents across her desk. We've been contacted by Judge Vasquez's office. The FBI wants to speak with you about your interactions with Richard Blackwell. Thomas raised an eyebrow. I barely interacted with him, just that brief phone conversation on the aircraft. It's not about what he said to you directly. It's about establishing a pattern of behavior, how he uses his power and influence to override normal protocols and procedures. Your experience is now evidence in a much larger case. Thomas absorbed this information silently. When he had refused to allow Vanessa Blackwell's behavior on his aircraft, he had never imagined it would lead to a federal fraud investigation. Life had strange currents sometimes. There's something else, Grace continued, sliding a folder toward him. Dr. Jackson reached out again. He's coming back to Chicago next week for a medical conference and wants to meet with you. He's also agreed to provide a detailed statement for our case. Thomas opened the folder to find a child's drawing of an airplane with a captain in the cockpit. Below, in crayon, were the words, Captain Richards, hero, alongside a carefully drawn heart. He felt a tightness in his throat. Lily drew this. Grace explained softly, Doctor. Jackson said she insisted on sending it to you. In his Manhattan office, Richard Blackwell was watching his empire begin to crumble. Major clients were distancing themselves. The company's stock had dropped 20% in 10 days, and the board of directors was calling for an emergency meeting to discuss his leadership. Sir, the FBI just left the Financial Services Division with boxes of documents, his assistant reported nervously. They had search warrants for records going back to 2017. Richard slammed his hand on the desk. Where are my lawyers? Why aren't they stopping this? They said the warrants are ironclad, sir. Judge Vasquez signed them personally. At the mention of Vasquez, Richard's expression changed from anger to something closer to fear. Elena Vasquez had a reputation for meticulous, by-the-book prosecutions and an almost preternatural ability to sense when powerful defendants were hiding evidence. His phone rang the airline's CEO. Richard, we need to talk about your board position. The CEO began without preamble. Given the current situation, the other board members feel it would be appropriate for you to take a leave of absence until these legal matters are resolved. You too. Richard's voice was dangerous. After everything I've done for this airline, you're throwing me overboard because of some social media outrage. It's not just the flight incident anymore, Richard. It's the federal investigation, the stock price impact, the reputational damage. We have a responsibility to our shareholders. I am a shareholder. A major one, which is why you should understand the position we're in. This isn't personal. The hell it isn't. Richard shouted. This is all because of that self-righteous pilot. If you had just handled him quietly like I told you to, none of this would be happening. There was a pause on the line. Richard, I should inform you that this call is being recorded as part of our standard compliance procedures. Richard froze, suddenly aware of how his outburst might sound to investigators. I'll have my resignation letter to you by the end of day, he said stiffly and hung up. As he stared out his office window at the Manhattan skyline, Richard Blackwell faced an unfamiliar sensation, powerlessness. For decades, his wealth and influence had insulated him from consequences, had ensured that rules applied to others, but never to him. All it had taken to begin his undoing was a drop of apple juice, a crying child, and a pilot who refused to be intimidated. The irony was bitter indeed. Across the country, in the modest Chicago apartment that had been his home for 20 years, Thomas Richards sat at his kitchen table with Helen contemplating their uncertain future. Grace thinks the wrongful termination suit could take months, maybe longer, he explained, nursing a cup of coffee. Even with all the public support, these cases move slowly. Helen covered his hand with hers. We'll be okay. We have savings, the house is mostly paid for, and I can pick up extra shifts at the hospital. Thomas nodded, though the weight of their situation wasn't lost on him. At 50, starting over in a new career wouldn't be easy. The airline industry operated like a small village, word traveled fast, and he had made a very powerful enemy. I keep thinking about Lily Jackson, he said after a moment. That little girl who was crying in her father's arms. I wonder if she knows that she helped set all this in motion. Children often do, Helen replied. They see the world as it should be, not as powerful people have arranged it for their own benefit. Thomas's phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia Rodriguez. Just resigned from the airline. They were trying to force me to change my testimony about what happened on the flight. Couldn't do it. Some things matter more than a job. He showed the message to Helen, who shook her head sadly. Another casualty. No, Thomas corrected her. Another person choosing principle over expediency. There's a difference. As evening fell over Chicago, Thomas stepped out onto his small balcony, gazing at the distant lights of O'Hare, where aircraft continued to take off and land without him. For 3 decades, flying had been his life, his identity. Now that was gone, at least temporarily. But something else had taken its place. A conviction that some stands were worth taking, regardless of the cost. In all his years in the cockpit, no decision had felt more right than the one he had made on Flight 317. Whatever came next, he would face it without regret. Thomas Richards adjusted his tie nervously as the makeup artist applied a final touch to his face. The bright lights of the television studio were unlike anything he had experienced before. As a pilot, he had always preferred the anonymity of the cockpit to the spotlight. 2 minutes, Captain Richards, the producer, called, checking her clipboard. Remember, just be yourself and tell your story exactly as it happened. That's what people want to hear. The past week had seen a seismic shift in media coverage of the Flight 317 incident. What had initially been reported as a case of a pilot overreacting to a minor customer service issue had transformed into a symbol of standing up against privilege and discrimination. And now Thomas was about to give his first television interview on National Morning, one of the country's most watched news programs. We're live in 5, 4, 3. The floor director's countdown ended with a silent point toward the host, Margaret Chen. Good morning, America. Today we're joined by Captain Thomas Richards, the airline pilot who found himself at the center of controversy after removing a board member's wife from a flight for racially harassing another passenger. Captain Richards was subsequently terminated after 30 years of service. Thank you for being here, Captain. Thomas nodded, trying to appear more comfortable than he felt. Thank you for having me, Margaret. Let's start at the beginning. Walk us through what happened on Flight 317. Thomas recounted the events clearly and factually, avoiding embellishment or emotional language. He described Vanessa Blackwell's behavior, Lily's tears, Dr. Jackson's dignity under pressure, and his own decision-making process. When Mrs. Blackwell refused to apologize for her behavior, I had a choice to make. He explained. I could either uphold the standards of conduct that are supposed to apply to everyone on my aircraft, or I could make an exception because of who she was married to. And you chose to uphold the standards knowing it could cost you your job. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about my job. I was thinking about that little girl crying in her father's arms, and about what message I would be sending if I allowed that kind of behavior to go unchallenged. Margaret leaned forward. Since your termination, we've learned that your record was spotless 30 years without a single disciplinary issue. How did it feel to lose your career over this incident? Thomas paused, considering his words carefully. It felt unjust. But I've never regretted the decision. Some principles are worth standing for even at great personal cost. We should note that the airline has released a statement saying your termination was about failure to follow protocol rather than the specific incident with Mrs. Blackwell. How do you respond to that? I'd point out that removing disruptive passengers who engage in discriminatory behavior is explicitly part of protocol. It's in the airline's own code of conduct. The only protocol I've violated was the unwritten one that powerful people are immune from consequences. The interview continued for 20 minutes with Thomas answering questions with the same calm authority he had displayed in the cockpit for decades. By the time it concluded, social media was erupting with support, the hashtag #ICaptainRichards trending again. In London, Dr. Elijah Jackson watched the interview on his tablet while taking a break between surgeries. Seeing Thomas articulate what had happened with such clarity brought back the mix of emotions he had felt that day, the humiliation, the anger, and then the profound gratitude when Thomas had stood up for him and Lily. He texted a simple message to Thomas. "Thank you for continuing to tell the truth. Lily and I are forever grateful." The interview marked a turning point in public perception. Throughout the day, other news outlets picked up the story, many conducting their own investigations into the incident and the Blackwells' history. By evening, a financial news network was running a special report titled "The Blackwell Empire Built on Sand." The program detailed not only the flight incident, but also the expanding federal investigation into Blackwell Enterprises, featuring interviews with financial experts and former employees. What began as a confrontation on an airplane has exposed what appears to be years of questionable business practices, the anchor explained. Federal investigators are now examining allegations of securities fraud, market manipulation, and financial misreporting that could amount to billions in investor damages. In her judicial chambers, Judge Elena Vasquez watched the coverage with interest. The public spotlight on Blackwell was accomplishing what years of quiet investigation had struggled to achieve. It was breaking the wall of silence around his operations. "Judge, you should see this," her clerk said, bringing in a tablet. On it was a video of Richard Blackwell leaving a restaurant surrounded by reporters. When asked about the allegations against him, Blackwell lost his composure. "This is a witch hunt," he shouted, pointing aggressively at the cameras. "That pilot had no right to humiliate my wife. He deserved to be fired, and I'd do it again." When pressed about the federal investigation, Blackwell's response was even more damaging. "The government has been after me for years because I'm successful. They can't stand to see someone win in this country anymore." Elena shook her head. "His lawyers must be having heart attacks right now." The clerk nodded. "There's more. 3 major investors in Blackwell Enterprises announced they're pulling out, and the stock dropped another 15% today." The unraveling continued throughout the week. Former colleagues of Thomas from the Air Force and the airline industry came forward to attest to his character and professionalism. One retired captain told a story about Thomas diverting a transatlantic flight to save a passenger suffering a heart attack despite the significant cost and disruption. "That's who Thomas Richards is," the former colleague explained. "Someone who does the right thing regardless of convenience or cost." Even James Wilson, Thomas's first officer on the fateful flight, seemed to be having second thoughts about his testimony. In a brief statement to reporters, he appeared uncomfortable and evasive. "Captain Richards made a judgment call in a difficult situation," he said. "While I might have handled it differently, I can't say he was wrong." The tide of public opinion had shifted so dramatically that the airline found itself in an increasingly untenable position. Their initial statement supporting Thomas's termination was now being scrutinized and ridiculed on social media. Aviation industry publications were questioning whether the airline had sacrificed safety and ethical standards to appease a powerful board member. In the corporate offices of the airline, executives were in crisis mode. The CEO paced the conference room where the leadership team had been meeting for hours. "Our position is becoming unsustainable," the chief legal officer admitted. Richards's interview was devastating, calm, professional, and directly contradicting our narrative about protocol violations. The public clearly sees him as the hero in this story, and now we have passengers from the flight coming forward to corroborate his account, the PR director added. 7 so far, all with consistent stories about Mrs. Blackwell's behavior. The CEO stopped pacing. What are our options? Legally, we're in a precarious position, the CLO explained. Richards has a strong wrongful termination case. If it goes to trial, discovery could be extremely embarrassing internal communications about Blackwell's influence, other incidents where protocol was ignored for VIPs. And the Blackwell connection is now toxic, the PR director interjected. With the federal investigation expanding daily, continuing to stand by his wife's side makes us look complicit in a culture of corruption and privilege. The CEO sighed heavily. So what are you suggesting? A settlement with Richards? The CLO said promptly. Reinstatement back. Pay public apology. We frame it as new information coming to light that has caused us to reevaluate the situation. Blackwell will be furious, the CEO noted. Blackwell is fighting for his survival right now, the PR director pointed out. He no longer has the leverage he once did. And frankly, sir, his board seat is almost certainly forfeit regardless. We can't afford to go down with his ship. As media coverage continued to evolve, Thomas Richards found himself in an unexpected position as a symbol of moral courage in the face of power and privilege. Letters and emails poured in from people sharing their own experiences of standing up against discrimination, often at personal cost. One evening, as Thomas sorted through the messages with Helen, he came across a particularly moving email from a young pilot in training. Captain Richards, I want to be the kind of pilot you are, one who understands that the real meaning of captain isn't just about flying the plane, but about protecting everyone on board in every way that matters. Helen noticed her husband's eyes glistening as he read the message. You've made a difference, she said softly. Whatever happens with the lawsuit or your career, you've shown people that standing up for what's right isn't just a platitude. It's a choice we all have to make when the moment comes. Thomas nodded, feeling a sense of peace despite the uncertainty of his future. That's all I ever wanted to do, the right thing. I never expected it to become this. The right thing at the right moment can change more than we imagine, Helen replied. You changed that little girl's life. You may have changed the airline industry, and you've certainly changed Richard Blackwell's world. As night fell over Chicago, the media continued to dissect every aspect of the story: the flight incident, Thomas's career, the Blackwell investigation, the airline's response. But beneath the headlines and punditry lay a simple truth that resonated with millions. One person's refusal to look the other way had set in motion a chain of events that was bringing long overdue accountability to those who had considered themselves beyond reach. The offices of Mendoza Legal Group occupied the 15th floor of a downtown Chicago building with views of Lake Michigan. Grace Mendoza had built her reputation defending employees against corporate giants. But even she had never handled a case that had captured public attention like Thomas Richards versus Atlantic Global Airlines. The settlement offer came in this morning, Grace announced, placing a document on the conference table where Thomas sat with Helen. They're getting nervous. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses and studied the proposal. Reinstatement as captain with full seniority. Back pay from the date of termination and a public statement acknowledging that my actions were consistent with airline policy regarding passenger conduct. It's a good offer, Grace observed. Better than I expected at this stage. Thomas looked up. What about the NDA? Grace nodded, having anticipated this question. Standard confidentiality clause. You wouldn't be able to discuss the terms of the settlement or make disparaging comments about the airline. So they want me back in the cockpit, but silent about why I was removed from it in the first place. That's typically how these settlements work, Grace explained. They're willing to make things right financially and professionally, but they want to control the narrative going forward. Helen squeezed her husband's hand. What are you thinking? Thomas removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I'm thinking that this was never about getting my job back. It was about standing up for what's right. How does accepting this settlement and then staying silent about what happened serve that principle? Grace leaned forward. Thomas, I understand your hesitation, but consider what you've already accomplished. The story is out there. Millions have seen the videos, read the articles, heard your interview. The airline is clearly acknowledging they were wrong, even if they're not saying it explicitly. And you'd be back doing what you love. Thomas stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the lake. What about Dr. Jackson and Lily? What message does it send to them if I take the money and go quiet? You could still maintain personal relationships, Grace pointed out. The NDA covers public statements, not private ones. Thomas turned back to face them. And what about all those people who've written to me saying that my stand inspired them, the young pilots who said they want to follow my example? Helen joined him at the window. Maybe the example isn't just about refusing to back down. Maybe sometimes it's also about knowing when you've made your point and can move forward. As they deliberated, Grace's assistant knocked and entered. Excuse me, but there's a Judge Vasquez on the line. She says it's important. Grace frowned. Elena Vasquez, the federal judge handling the Blackwell investigation. She took the call on speakerphone. Judge Vasquez, this is Grace Mendoza with Thomas Richards present. Thank you for taking my call. The judge's voice was clear and authoritative. Captain Richards, I wanted to speak with you directly. My office has been following your case closely as it intersects with our investigation into Blackwell Enterprises. I understand, Your Honor, Thomas replied. I've received information that the airline has offered you a settlement. While I cannot advise you on whether to accept it, I want you to be aware that we've issued subpoenas for testimony from all key figures involved in the Flight 317 incident. Regardless of any private settlement, we will need your testimony for our case against Richard Blackwell. Thomas and Grace exchanged glances. What exactly are you investigating? Judge Grace asked carefully. Beyond the financial fraud allegations that are already public, we've uncovered evidence suggesting that Richard Blackwell has a history of using his position to influence company policies and practices in ways that may constitute corporate governance violations. Your incident appears to be part of a pattern. I see, Thomas said. And my testimony would be about my direct interactions with Blackwell during the flight incident. Yes, and any subsequent communications or actions that might demonstrate how he wielded his influence to affect your employment status. After the call ended, Thomas sat heavily in his chair. So, even if I settle with the airline, this isn't over. It's bigger than just your termination now, Grace confirmed. The Blackwell investigation has expanded and your experience has become evidence in a federal case. Before Thomas could respond, Grace's phone chimed with a news alert. She checked it and her eyes widened. You need to see this. She turned her tablet toward them, displaying a breaking news headline, FBI raids Blackwell Enterprises headquarters in fraud investigation. The article detailed how federal agents had entered Blackwell's New York offices with search warrants, removing boxes of documents and electronic devices. Photos showed stone-faced agents escorting employees from the building while news helicopters captured the scene from above. This is unprecedented, Grace murmured. They must have substantial evidence to take such a public action against a company of this size. Thomas stared at the images, a complex mix of emotions washing over him. He had never set out to bring down Richard Blackwell or his company. He had simply refused to allow racial harassment on his aircraft. Yet that single decision had seemingly triggered a cascade of consequences that were still unfolding. I need to think about the settlement offer, Thomas said finally. This changes things. Meanwhile, in the federal courthouse, Judge Elena Vasquez was reviewing the preliminary findings from the Blackwell raid with prosecutors. The documents corroborate Foster's allegations, the lead prosecutor explained. We found evidence of systematic financial manipulation dating back at least 8 years. But there's more. We've also uncovered communications suggesting Blackwell regularly used his board positions to override normal corporate governance procedures, including pressuring the airline to terminate Captain Richards, Elena surmised. Exactly. We have emails between Blackwell and the airline CEO that explicitly discuss using Richards as an example to maintain Blackwell's influence over operational decisions. Elena removed her glasses. This has evolved far beyond one incident on an aircraft. It has. Blackwell appears to have operated for years with the belief that his wealth and connections placed him above ordinary accountability. Captain Richards may have been the first person to successfully challenge that assumption. As the legal machinery continued to advance, Thomas and Helen returned home to find an unexpected visitor waiting on their porch, Dr. Elijah Jackson, who had flown in from London for a medical conference. Dr. Jackson, Thomas said, surprised. I didn't realize you were in Chicago. Elijah stood extending his hand. I apologize for coming unannounced. I tried calling, but with the time difference. Please come in. Helen invited warmly. Once settled in the living room, Elijah got straight to the point. I've been following everything that's happened. The airline terminating you, the Blackwell investigation, all of it. I needed to tell you in person how sorry I am that standing up for Lily and me has cost you so much. Thomas shook his head. You have nothing to apologize for. The cost of doing the right thing isn't your responsibility. Still, I want to help. I've provided a detailed statement to your attorney about what happened on the flight. I'm also willing to testify if needed. And he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder. Lily insisted I bring you these. Inside were more of Lily's drawings, colorful depictions of airplanes' pilots, and one particularly touching image of a tall figure in a captain's uniform standing protectively beside a small girl with braids. She talks about you all the time, Elijah said softly. The captain who wasn't afraid of the mean lady. You've become something of a hero to her. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. How is she adjusting to London? Better now. The first few weeks were difficult, but children are resilient. She's making friends at her new school. Elijah hesitated, then added, I've been teaching her about courage, that it isn't about never being afraid, but about doing what's right even when you are afraid. You've given her a powerful example of that. As they continued talking, the television in the corner broadcast another update about the Blackwell investigation. The camera showed Richard Blackwell leaving his attorney's office, surrounded by reporters shouting questions. His face was tight with barely controlled fury. Sometimes I wonder if all this would have happened eventually, even without the flight incident, Elijah mused watching the footage. People like Blackwell often believe they're untouchable until suddenly they're not. Perhaps Thomas agreed. But it took someone like Cameron Foster with specific knowledge to connect the dots. Without the flight incident bringing attention to the Blackwells, would his allegations have gained the same traction? The question hung in the air, unanswerable but profound. How a single moment of principle could set in motion events that changed countless lives, toppled empires, and brought long-hidden truths into the light. As the evening progressed, Thomas found himself reconsidering the settlement offer. Perhaps Grace and Helen were right. Perhaps he had already accomplished what mattered most, standing for principle when it counted and inspiring others to do the same. Perhaps it was time to move forward back into the cockpit where he belonged. But as he looked at Lily's drawings spread across his coffee table, Thomas knew his decision would not be based on what was easiest or most practical. It would be based on the same question that had guided him on Flight 317. What is the right thing to do? The grand marble lobby of the federal courthouse buzzed with activity as journalists and spectators gathered for the day's proceedings. At the center of the storm was Richard Blackwell, once untouchable, now fighting desperately to preserve what remained of his empire and freedom. For Thomas Richards, sitting in the witness gallery, the scene was surreal. 3 months ago, he had been a respected airline captain with an unblemished 30-year record. Now he was a key witness in what the media had dubbed the financial fraud case of the decade. Judge Elena Vasquez entered the courtroom, her authoritative presence immediately commanding silence. The court will now hear testimony in the matter of the United States versus Richard Blackwell and Blackwell Enterprises. As prosecutors laid out their case, the enormity of Blackwell's alleged crimes became clear. Years of financial manipulation, insider trading, and corporate governance violations had allegedly defrauded investors of billions. But equally damning were the patterns of intimidation, retaliation, and abuse of power that had allowed the scheme to continue unchecked for so long. Your Honor, the lead prosecutor explained, we will demonstrate that Mr. Blackwell deliberately created a culture of fear and retribution that silenced potential whistleblowers. The incident on Flight 317 exemplifies this pattern when Captain Richards refused to bend rules for Mrs. Blackwell. Mr. Blackwell used his board position to have Richards terminated, sending a clear message throughout the organization about the consequences of challenging his authority. From his place at the defense table, Richard Blackwell stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. His wife Vanessa was notably absent, having retreated from public view after the disastrous viral videos of her behavior. Thomas was called to testify after Cameron Foster, whose detailed account of discovering financial irregularities had visibly shaken several jurors. Taking the stand, Thomas recounted the events on Flight 307 with the same calm precision he had always brought to his work as a pilot. And when you refused to accommodate Mrs. Blackwell's demands, what happened? The prosecutor asked. She called her husband and put him on speakerphone, Thomas explained. Mr. Blackwell then threatened my career directly, stating that he could have me fired with one call to the CEO. And was that threat carried out? Yes. Upon landing in London, I was immediately suspended. 1 week later, I was terminated after 30 years of service with a perfect record. During your conversation with Mr. Blackwell, did he indicate any concern about his wife's racially charged language or behavior? No. His only concern appeared to be accommodating her demands and asserting his authority over me and the aircraft. When it was the defense's turn for cross-examination, Blackwell's attorney approached with practiced confidence. Captain Richards, isn't it true that airline protocols give considerable discretion to the flight crew in handling passenger disputes? Yes, within certain parameters, Thomas replied. And in your 30 years of flying, had you ever before removed a passenger for what was essentially a verbal dispute? I had removed passengers for disruptive behavior, including verbal abuse toward other passengers or crew. Mrs. Blackwell's behavior fell into that category. The attorney paced before the witness stand. Would you agree that a drop of apple juice on a shoe is a rather minor incident to escalate to the point of removing a passenger? Thomas met his gaze steadily. It wasn't about the apple juice. It was about Mrs. Blackwell's subsequent behavior, her racially charged language, her refusal to apologize, and her escalating hostility that was disrupting the entire cabin. In your conversation with Mr. Blackwell, did he ever explicitly tell you to violate any airline policy? He instructed me to move Dr. Jackson and his daughter despite their having valid tickets for their assigned seats solely to accommodate his wife's prejudice. That would have violated our non-discrimination policies. As the testimony continued, Thomas maintained his composure, neither embellishing nor minimizing the events. When he stepped down from the witness stand, he noticed Richard Blackwell watching him with cold hatred. Outside the courthouse, a media frenzy awaited. Thomas declined to comment following his attorney's guidance, but cameras captured his dignified exit. The contrast between his calm demeanor and the chaotic scenes surrounding Blackwell Enterprises in recent weeks was not lost on observers. Later that evening, a bombshell dropped. During an emergency press conference called ostensibly to defend his reputation, Richard Blackwell lost control. Facing pointed questions about new evidence discovered in the FBI raid, he erupted. This entire witch hunt began because of one self-righteous pilot. He shouted, jabbing his finger toward the cameras. Richards thinks he's some kind of hero for humiliating my wife, but he's just a pawn being used by my competitors and enemies in the government who've been trying to destroy me for years. When a reporter asked about the racial component of the original incident, Blackwell's composure shattered completely. My wife was upset about her shoes. That doesn't make her racist. That pilot had no right to embarrass her in front of an entire plane full of people. If I still had my board seat, I'd fire him all over again. The meltdown continued for several excruciating minutes before Blackwell's attorneys managed to usher him away from the microphones. But the damage was done. The outburst was broadcast live across multiple networks and immediately went viral online. In Judge Vasquez's chambers, the prosecutor couldn't contain a grim smile as they reviewed the footage. He just corroborated Captain Richards's testimony about retaliatory intent, the prosecutor noted, and implicated himself in corporate governance violations on national television. Judge Vasquez maintained her judicial composure, but her eyes reflected satisfaction. Some people believe their power insulates them from accountability for so long that they lose the ability to recognize the line they shouldn't cross. Meanwhile, at the airline's corporate headquarters, the CEO was convening an emergency board meeting. The television in the conference room replayed Blackwell's meltdown on mute as executives exchanged concerned glances. "This changes our position significantly," the chief legal officer advised. Blackwell just publicly admitted to using his board influence to have Richards terminated as retaliation. That's textbook wrongful termination. And he did it right in the middle of our settlement negotiations, the CEO added, rubbing his temples. Richards's attorney will use this to demand much more favorable terms. "Sir, I think we need to consider more than just the legal implications," the newly appointed chief ethics officer interjected. "This is a defining moment for our corporate culture. How we respond will send a message to every employee about whether we truly value integrity or simply bow to power and influence." The CEO nodded slowly. "Draft a new proposal. Full reinstatement, back pay, a public apology that specifically acknowledges Richards acted in accordance with our values and policies, and no NDA." "No confidentiality clause?" the CLO asked, surprised. "That's unusual." "So is having a board member publicly admit to forcing us to fire a captain for enforcing our own anti-discrimination policies?" the CEO replied. "It's time we stood on the right side of this situation regardless of the short-term costs." Back in his Chicago home, Thomas watched the Blackwell meltdown with Helen. Both of them stunned by the self-inflicted damage. He just can't accept that someone stood up to him and won. Helen observed. Even now, with everything crumbling around him, he still thinks the real problem was your refusal to accommodate his wife's entitlement. Thomas's phone rang. It was Grace Mendoza. "Thomas, you're not going to believe this. The airline just withdrew their original settlement offer and replaced it with something much better. Full reinstatement, back pay, public apology, and no NDA. They're essentially admitting they were wrong and giving you complete freedom to tell your story." After the call, Thomas sat in thoughtful silence. The vindication was complete, but he felt no triumph or satisfaction, only a sense that justice so long delayed was finally taking its natural course. "Are you going to accept?" Helen asked. "I think so," Thomas replied. "Not for the money or the job, though I do miss flying, but because accepting sends a message, too, that standing up for what's right doesn't have to be a one-way ticket to martyrdom. Sometimes principles and practicality can align." The next day, as Thomas prepared to meet with Grace to finalize the settlement acceptance, breaking news alerts flooded in. The FBI had raided Blackwell's personal residences in New York, Miami, and the Hamptons, escalating the investigation to new heights. Hours later, in a move that shocked even seasoned financial analysts, major investors in Blackwell Enterprises announced they were withdrawing support. The company's stock plummeted, trading was temporarily halted, and rumors of bankruptcy filings began circulating. The empire that Richard Blackwell had built through intimidation, financial manipulation, and the belief that rules didn't apply to him was collapsing at breathtaking speed. All because he couldn't accept that a pilot had drawn a line and refused to cross it. As Thomas signed the settlement papers in Grace's office, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. A minor incident on an aircraft had exposed fault lines of power privilege and accountability that ran far deeper than anyone could have imagined. "It's official," Grace said, gathering the documents. "You're reinstated effective immediately with full seniority and back pay. The airline's public statement will be released this afternoon." "Thank you for everything," Thomas said sincerely. "I should be thanking you," Grace replied. "Cases like yours remind us all that integrity isn't just a buzzword for corporate mission statements. It's a choice people make when it matters most." As they shook hands, Grace's assistant rushed in with another news alert. Richard Blackwell has been indicted on 17 federal counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. If convicted, he faces up to 30 years in prison. The breaking point had finally arrived. What had begun with a drop of apple juice had culminated in the downfall of a man who had believed himself untouchable. And though Thomas had never sought to bring Blackwell down, he understood now that sometimes justice required someone to simply stand firm when the moment demanded it. The headquarters of Atlantic Global Airlines occupied a gleaming glass tower in downtown Chicago, its soaring atrium designed to evoke the freedom of flight. Today, however, the mood in the executive boardroom on the 44th floor was anything but free. Tension hung in the air as the remaining board members assembled for an emergency session. CEO Michael Preston called the meeting to order, his normally confident demeanor subdued. "Ladies and gentlemen, the events of the past 48 hours have forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our corporate governance and values. Richard Blackwell's public meltdown and subsequent indictment have placed this airline in an untenable position." The room remained silent as Preston continued. "We allowed a board member's influence to override our own policies and principles. In doing so, we failed not just Captain Richards, but every employee who looks to leadership for ethical guidance." Karen Davis, the newly appointed Chief Ethics Officer, spoke next. "The settlement with Captain Richards is finalized. He has accepted our offer of full reinstatement with back pay. Our public statement acknowledging that his actions were in accordance with our values has been drafted and is ready for release." "What about the media fallout?" asked Operations Director Frank Miller. "We're being portrayed as Blackwell's willing accomplices. The best way to address that is with decisive action and radical transparency," Preston replied. "Which brings me to the next agenda item. I'm proposing a comprehensive review of all decisions influenced by Richard Blackwell during his tenure on the board, particularly personnel decisions that may have similarly undermined our stated values." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Such a review would likely uncover other instances where power and influence had trumped merit and principle. Additionally, Preston continued, "I'm recommending that we establish an independent ethics council with representation from frontline employees, including pilots and flight attendants. Their role will be to ensure that our policies on passenger conduct and employee protection are consistently enforced regardless of who is involved." As the meeting progressed, the discussion shifted from damage control to genuine reform. By the time they adjourned 3 hours later, the board had unanimously approved a series of measures that would fundamentally transform the airline's approach to corporate governance, ethical decision-making, and employee empowerment. Meanwhile, across town, Thomas Richards was meeting with Grace Mendoza to review the final settlement documents. "There's something I haven't told you," Grace said as Thomas finished signing the paperwork. "Sofia Rodriguez has been offered her job back as well, with a promotion to training supervisor. The airline recognized that she was pressured to change her testimony about the incident." Thomas smiled. "She deserves it. Standing up to that kind of pressure takes real courage." "Speaking of courage," Grace continued, Dr. Jackson called this morning. He and Lily are returning to Chicago next week for a follow-up conference. He asked if you'd be willing to meet them. Of course, Thomas replied without hesitation. I'd like that very much. Later that afternoon, Thomas drove to the Flight Operations Center at O'Hare, where he would begin the process of recertification before returning to active flying status. As he walked through the familiar corridors, he noticed the subtle shift in how colleagues regarded him. Nods of respect, handshakes offered with genuine warmth, whispered words of support. In the pilot's briefing room, he encountered James Wilson for the first time since the disciplinary hearing. The younger pilot froze when he saw Thomas, conflict evident in his expression. Captain Richards. James acknowledged stiffly. I heard about your reinstatement. First Officer Wilson, Thomas replied evenly. An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Finally, James spoke again, his voice lower. I want you to know that what I said at the hearing, I was afraid for my job, for my family's security. I understand fear, Thomas said, but understanding it doesn't make it a justification. No, it doesn't. James looked away. I've been reassigned to regional routes. Smaller aircraft, shorter flights. A demotion in all but name. Thomas studied the younger man. What will you do? Accept it. Learn from it. James met Thomas's gaze directly for the first time. Do better next time. Thomas nodded once. That's all any of us can do. He turned to leave, then paused. The real test of character isn't avoiding mistakes, James. It's what you do after you make them. As Thomas continued through the operations center, he was stopped by the chief pilot, David Anderson. Welcome back, Thomas Anderson said, extending his hand. We've scheduled your recertification flights for next week. The airline is eager to have you back in the air. Thank you, David. It feels good to be back. Anderson hesitated, then added in a lower voice, For what it's worth, many of us disagreed with your termination. We just didn't speak up loudly enough. That's changing now. The airline's public statement was released at 4 p.m., perfectly timed for the evening news cycle. Atlantic Global Airlines acknowledges that Captain Thomas Richards acted in accordance with our core values and established protocols during the incident on Flight 3117. His commitment to ensuring that all passengers are treated with dignity and respect regardless of their status or connections exemplifies the highest standards of professionalism that we expect from our employees. We deeply regret the manner in which this situation was handled and are implementing comprehensive reforms to ensure that such an injustice is never repeated. The statement made headlines across national media not for its careful corporate language, but for what it represented: a major corporation publicly admitting it had sacrificed principle for power and committing to change. That evening, as Thomas and Helen watched the coverage of the airline's statement alongside updates on the expanding Blackwell investigation, Thomas received a text message from Sofia Rodriguez. Justice doesn't always fly direct, but it eventually reaches its destination. Welcome back, Captain. For the first time in months, Thomas fell asleep with a sense of peace. The principles he had stood for had been vindicated not just personally, but on a scale he could never have imagined when he made that fateful decision on Flight 317. As he drifted off, he found himself thinking not of Richard Blackwell's downfall or his own reinstatement, but of a little girl's drawing of a pilot standing tall, protecting those in his care, the simplest and most profound understanding of what his job had always truly been about. 6 months after Thomas Richards's reinstatement, the changes at Atlantic Global Airlines had extended far beyond a single captain's return to the cockpit. The airline had emerged from the Blackwell scandal transformed not just in policy, but in culture. Thomas stood before a group of 30 new flight attendants in the company's training facility. Behind him, a presentation slide displayed the airline's revised passenger conduct policy. The authority you're granted isn't arbitrary, Thomas explained to the attentive trainees. It's rooted in a fundamental principle: every person on that aircraft deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Your job isn't just to serve drinks and demonstrate safety features. It's to help maintain an environment where that principle is upheld. At the back of the room, Sofia Rodriguez watched with quiet satisfaction. In her new role as training supervisor, she had personally requested that Thomas be involved in developing the airline's enhanced anti-discrimination protocols. "Captain Richards speaks from experience," Sofia added, stepping forward. "6 months ago, he lost his job for enforcing these exact principles. Today, those same principles are being woven into the fabric of our company culture." After the session concluded, Thomas and Sofia walked together toward the operations center. "The new hires are impressive," Thomas observed. "More diverse than I can remember seeing before. The airline has been very deliberate about broadening its recruitment strategies," Sofia replied. "And applications have increased significantly since the policy changes were publicized. People want to work for a company that stands for something." At the operations center, they parted ways, Sofia to her next training session, Thomas to prepare for his afternoon flight to London. The route held special significance for him, now being the same one where the confrontation with Vanessa Blackwell had occurred. As Thomas reviewed the flight plan, CEO Michael Preston appeared in the doorway. "Captain Richards, got a minute?" "Of course, sir." Preston closed the door behind him. "I wanted to personally update you on our progress. The Independent Ethics Council has completed its review of Blackwell-influenced decisions. We've identified 7 other employees who were unfairly terminated or demoted due to his interference. All have been offered reinstatement or appropriate compensation." Thomas nodded. "That's good to hear. Additionally, our new board members have unanimously approved the Richards Protocol, a formal procedure ensuring that no passenger, regardless of status, is exempt from our conduct policies." Preston smiled slightly. "Having your name attached to the policy sent a powerful message throughout the organization. I appreciate that, sir, though I never sought to become the face of corporate reform. Sometimes leadership finds us rather than the other way around," Preston observed. The quarterly employee survey results came in yesterday. Trust in senior management is up 28%. Employees specifically cited the handling of your case and the subsequent reforms as evidence that the company has changed. After Preston left, Thomas completed his flight preparations with his customary thoroughness. As he walked through the terminal toward his gate, he passed a newsstand where financial magazines displayed cover stories about the ongoing Blackwell saga. The most recent developments had been dramatic. Following his indictment on 17 federal counts, Richard Blackwell had attempted to flee the country on a private jet, only to be apprehended at a small airfield in New Jersey. The attempted flight had nullified his bail arrangement, landing him in federal custody pending trial. Blackwell Enterprises, once a financial powerhouse, had filed for bankruptcy protection as investors fled and assets were frozen by court order. The corporate headquarters that had once dominated the Manhattan skyline now stood half-empty, its remaining employees updating resumes as they awaited the inevitable layoffs. Vanessa Blackwell had filed for divorce, her legal team working to distance her from her husband's financial crimes, even as she faced her own social ostracism. The designer clothes and exclusive social circles that had once defined her existence had given way to legal consultations and closed curtains. At Gate 17, Thomas's crew was waiting. His new first officer, Diana Martinez, greeted him with a crisp salute. "Pre-flight checks complete, Captain. Weather en route looks good, though we're expecting some turbulence over the Atlantic. Thank you, First Officer Martinez. Let's do our walkthrough." As they moved through the cabin, Thomas noted the new placards near the emergency exits quietly outlining the airline's passenger conduct expectations. The changes weren't just in policy documents, but in visible everyday reminders of the company's renewed commitment. In premium economy, a flight attendant was helping a woman settle her young son into his seat. The scene reminded Thomas of Dr. Jackson and Lily, whom he had met for lunch the previous week during their return visit to Chicago. Lily had grown an inch since he'd last seen her and had excitedly shown him her new sticker collection. More significantly, she had approached him without the shyness she had displayed on the flight, clearly no longer associating authority figures with the fear she had experienced during the confrontation with Vanessa Blackwell. "She talks about you all the time," Dr. Jackson had confided while Lily was distracted with dessert. "Her teacher told me she wrote a story for class about the brave captain who wasn't afraid of mean people. You've become something of a legend in our household." The memory warmed Thomas as he completed his cabin walkthrough. By standing firm in that moment months ago, he had not only enforced a policy, but had shown a child that adults could and should protect each other from cruelty and injustice. As passengers boarded, Thomas stood at the cockpit door greeting them with the same dignified professionalism he had always brought to his role. Some recognized him. He had become something of a public figure since the incident, but most simply saw their captain a reassuring presence as they prepared for the journey across the ocean. In the months since his reinstatement, Thomas had received hundreds of messages from fellow airline employees, passengers, and even strangers who had been moved by his stand. Some shared their own stories of facing discrimination. Others expressed gratitude for the reminder that principles still mattered in a world that often seemed to prioritize power and profit above all else. The airline industry itself was experiencing a quiet but significant transformation. Other major carriers, watching the public response to Atlantic Global's reforms, had begun reviewing and strengthening their own policies regarding passenger conduct and employee protection. Trade publications had featured articles analyzing the Richards effect, how one captain's refusal to bend principles had triggered a wave of changes across the industry. As Thomas settled into the captain's chair for takeoff, he reflected on the strange, winding journey that had brought him to this moment. He had never sought to become a symbol or to bring down a powerful man's empire. He had simply made the choice that his conscience demanded when faced with injustice. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the Chicago sky, banking gently toward the east as it began its transatlantic journey. Below the city, spread out in a grid of lights and shadows, each point representing countless human stories unfolding in their own complex ways. Thomas engaged the autopilot once they reached cruising altitude, the familiar routine both comforting and meaningful. He was back where he belonged, not just physically in the cockpit, but spiritually aligned with the values that had guided his life and career. The transformation that had begun with a single decision on a single flight had rippled outward, touching lives and institutions in ways he could never have anticipated. But perhaps that was always the nature of principles. Their true power lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when faced with a choice between convenience and conscience. Someone chooses the more difficult but more honorable path. Exactly 1 year after the incident on Flight 317, Thomas Richards stood in the cockpit of the same Boeing 787, preparing to command the same route from Chicago to London. The symmetry wasn't lost on him as he completed his pre-flight checks with practiced precision. The airline had changed considerably in the intervening year. Following the Blackwell scandal, 3 new board members had been appointed, including a respected ethics professor and a civil rights attorney. The corporate headquarters had been renovated to feature a prominent display in the lobby highlighting the company's renewed commitment to integrity and equal treatment. Captain Richards' First Officer Martinez's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Ground crew reports were clear for boarding. Thank you, Diana. Let's get our passengers home." Thomas adjusted his uniform cap and stepped out of the cockpit to take his customary position near the aircraft entrance. It was an old-school touch that newer pilots often skipped, but Thomas believed that seeing the captain as they boarded reassured passengers and set the right tone for the flight. As the boarding process began, Thomas greeted each passenger with a nod and a brief welcome. Some recognized him, offering words of appreciation or respect. Others simply returned his greeting and continued to their seats, unaware of the significance this particular flight held for him. About halfway through the boarding process, Thomas noticed a familiar face approaching Dr. Elijah Jackson, with Lily beside him, now 8 years old, and visibly more confident than the frightened child Thomas had first encountered. Captain Richards. Lily exclaimed, her face lighting up with recognition. Thomas smiled warmly. "Well, hello there, Miss Jackson. Are you and your father traveling with us today?" Dr. Jackson extended his hand. "We're heading back to London after a conference here in Chicago. I had no idea you'd be our captain. What a remarkable coincidence." "Or perhaps not so coincidental," Thomas replied. "I specifically requested this flight when I saw the date on the schedule. 1 year ago today." Understanding dawned in Elijah's eyes. "Of course. I hadn't realized the anniversary." "Daddy says you're a hero," Lily interjected, looking up at Thomas with unabashed admiration. Thomas crouched to meet her at eye level. "Your daddy's the real hero, Lily. He's the one saving children's hearts in London." Lily considered this thoughtfully. "Can there be two heroes?" Thomas chuckled. "I suppose there can. I made you something," she said, reaching into her backpack and withdrawing a carefully folded paper. "It's for your anniversary." Thomas unfolded the drawing to find a colorful depiction of an aircraft with a captain standing beside it. Above, in careful letters, was written, "Thank you for being brave." The simplicity and sincerity of the gesture touched him deeply. "This is wonderful, Lily. Thank you. I'll keep it with me in the cockpit for good luck." As the Jacksons continued to their seats, Thomas felt a profound sense of completion. A year ago, he had made a decision that had cost him dearly but had ultimately affirmed the principles by which he had always tried to live. Now, seeing Lily's confidence and joy, he knew without doubt that it had been worth it. The remainder of the boarding process proceeded smoothly until Thomas noticed a hesitant figure approaching James Wilson, his former first officer, now in the uniform of a regional carrier. Captain Richards James said, his voice uncertain. "I didn't expect to see you here," James Thomas acknowledged. "Are you deadheading back to London?" "Yes, sir. Covering a staffing shortage on short notice." James shifted uncomfortably. "I've wanted to speak with you properly for some time. What I did during your hearing, I've had to live with that decision every day since." Thomas studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine remorse. "We all make choices we have to live with, James. The question is what we learn from them." "I've learned more than I can say," James replied quietly. "Watching how everything unfolded after you were fired, it changed my perspective on what matters in this profession and life, really." "Good," Thomas said simply. "That's all any of us can hope for, to keep learning to do better next time." James nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Thank you, Captain. For what it's worth, many of us who stayed silent then have found our voices now. Your stand changed things not just at the airline, but for a lot of us personally." As James continued to his seat, Thomas reflected on how the ripples from that day had touched so many lives in different ways. His personal vindication had never been the point, but it was gratifying to see that his actions had inspired others to examine their own choices and values. Once boarding was complete, Thomas returned to the cockpit to prepare for departure. Diana had already begun the pre-flight sequence, her movements efficient and precise. "Everything all right, Captain?" she asked, noting his contemplative expression. "Just reflecting," Thomas replied. "It's been exactly 1 year since the incident that led to my termination and reinstatement." Diana nodded. "I remember following the story. It's part of why I requested a transfer to this base to fly with you specifically. What you did, it mattered to a lot of us." Thomas was touched by the admission. He hadn't realized that his actions had influenced other pilots' career decisions. As they taxied toward the runway, Thomas made his customary announcement to the passengers. His voice, warm and authoritative, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Richards. We're third in line for takeoff and should be airborne in approximately 10 minutes. Our flying time to London Heathrow will be 7 hours and 15 minutes. We're expecting clear skies for most of our journey with some light turbulence as we approach the British Isles. My first officer, Diana Martinez, and I, along with our cabin crew, are committed to making your flight as comfortable and pleasant as possible. Welcome aboard Flight 317. The familiarity of the routine was comforting, but there was a deeper resonance to the words now. The commitment to passenger comfort and safety had taken on additional layers of meaning in the wake of everything that had happened. As the Boeing 787 accelerated down the runway and lifted into the evening sky, Thomas felt the familiar surge of exhilaration that had drawn him to flying 3 decades earlier. The weight and responsibility of guiding hundreds of lives safely across an ocean remained as profound as ever. But now it was complemented by an awareness of the broader impact his actions could have. Somewhere behind him in the cabin, Lily Jackson was probably watching the ascent with wonder, her father beside her. James Wilson was perhaps reflecting on his own journey of regret and growth. And countless other passengers, each with their own stories and challenges, were trusting him to deliver them safely to their destination. It was Thomas realized everything he had ever wanted from his career, not just the technical mastery of flight, but the deeper purpose of creating a space where every person was protected, respected, and valued equally. As the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude and the lights of Chicago receded behind them, Thomas checked the navigation display. Before them stretched the vast Atlantic, and beyond it London, and whatever new chapters awaited. The journey continued, both literal and metaphorical, carrying them all forward into possibilities yet unknown. 3 years after Flight 317, the ripple effects of Thomas Richards's stand continued to spread through the airline industry and beyond. What had begun as one captain's refusal to tolerate discrimination had evolved into a movement for accountability and ethical leadership that transcended its origins. Atlantic Global Airlines had transformed itself from a company scrambling to contain a PR crisis into an industry leader in corporate ethics and inclusive practices. The Richards Protocol for handling passenger conduct issues had been adopted by 5 other major carriers, standardizing the approach to discrimination incidents regardless of a passenger's status or connections. On a brisk autumn morning, Thomas stood at a podium in the airline's training center, addressing a class of new captains preparing to assume command of their own aircraft. "The stripes on your shoulders represent more than technical competence," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "They represent a commitment to protect every person on your aircraft, not just their physical safety, but their dignity as human beings." The lecture hall was filled to capacity with some attendees from other airlines participating through a newly established industry exchange program. The incident on Flight 317 had become a standard case study in leadership training, not just for pilots, but for executives across multiple industries. After the session, a young female captain approached Thomas. "Captain Richards, I just wanted to thank you. I was a first officer when the Blackwell incident happened. Watching how everything unfolded, your stand, the consequences, and ultimately the vindication, it shaped how I approach command decisions." Thomas nodded appreciatively. "The uniform gives us authority, but our actions give us moral authority. That's something no title or position can confer." Later that day, Thomas visited the newly renovated corporate headquarters, where a wall in the main lobby now displayed the company's principles of inclusive service in bold letters. Among them was a quote attributed to him, "In the air as on the ground. Dignity is not a privilege reserved for the powerful, it is a right that belongs to everyone." CEO Michael Preston met him in the lobby. The quarterly ethics compliance numbers are in Preston Reported. Reported incidents of discriminatory behavior are down 60% since we implemented the new policies. More significantly, employee intervention in such incidents is up 80%. People are speaking up now rather than looking away. That's the real victory, Thomas observed. Not just policies on paper, but a culture where doing the right thing is expected and supported. "We're not alone anymore either," Preston added. 3 other major airlines have adopted similar frameworks. There's talk of an industry-wide standard being developed through the International Air Transport Association. As they walked through the building, Thomas noted the diverse faces in the executive offices, a marked change from 3 years earlier when the leadership had been notably homogeneous. The Blackwell case finally reached its conclusion, Preston mentioned as they entered his office. The Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal. He'll serve the full 12-year sentence. Thomas nodded, though the fate of Richard Blackwell had long ceased to be his primary concern. The man's downfall, while deserved, had been a side effect rather than the goal of Thomas's actions. "Have you heard from Dr. Jackson recently?" Preston asked. "Yes, he and Lily visited Chicago last month," Thomas replied with a smile. "Lily's 11 now and still determined to become a pilot. She's joined a young aviators program at her school in London." The thought of Lily, the frightened child whose dignity he had defended 3 years ago, now pursuing her own dreams of flight, was deeply satisfying to Thomas. It represented the most meaningful impact of his stand, not the corporate reforms or Richard Blackwell's downfall, but the message sent to a young girl that she deserved to be treated with respect, and that adults would stand up for that principle. After leaving the headquarters, Thomas drove to a community center in a predominantly minority neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where he volunteered monthly with an aviation education program for underserved youth. The program, partially funded by the Jackson Foundation for Dignity and Equality, introduced young people to careers in aviation, while emphasizing the values of integrity and ethical leadership. Today, he was joined by a special guest, Sophia Rodriguez, who had risen to become Atlantic Global's Director of Cabin Crew Training after her courageous testimony in support of Thomas during the investigation. "They're so excited to meet you," Sophia told him as they entered the classroom where 20 teenagers waited, especially since the documentary aired last month. The PBS documentary Principles in the Sky had chronicled the Flight 317 incident and its aftermath, becoming an unexpected hit and sparking national conversations about corporate accountability and moral courage in leadership positions. For 2 hours, Thomas and Sophia shared their experiences and answered questions from the students about flying about, standing up for what's right, and about navigating challenges in predominantly white industries. "Were you scared when you decided to kick Mrs. Blackwell off the plane?" one young woman asked. "Not scared," Thomas replied thoughtfully. "Concerned, certainly. I knew there could be consequences. But sometimes the right decision isn't the one that's best for your career. It's the one that lets you face yourself in the mirror the next morning." Afterward, as they walked to their cars, Sophia mentioned, "James Wilson contacted me last week. He's been recommended for a captain position at his regional airline." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "After everything that happened. Apparently he's been quite vocal about the lessons he learned from the Blackwell incident. Uses his own mistakes as a teaching tool for new pilots on the importance of moral courage." Sophia paused. "People can grow, I suppose. That's what we hope for," Thomas agreed. "Not just better policies, but better people making those policies." That evening, as Thomas arrived home, he found a package waiting on his doorstep. Inside was a framed photograph of Lily Jackson sitting in the captain's seat of a flight simulator, grinning broadly beneath a borrowed captain's hat. A note from Elijah accompanied it. "She hasn't wavered in her career plans. Your impact continues. With eternal gratitude." Elijah. Thomas placed the photo on his desk beside the original drawing Lily had given him 3 years ago on the anniversary flight. The contrast between the frightened child of that first encounter and the confident young person pursuing her dreams was perhaps the most profound measure of the change that had been set in motion that day. Later, as he prepared for his flight to Tokyo the next morning, Thomas reflected on the strange winding journey that had brought him here. A single moment of principle had triggered consequences beyond anything he could have imagined. Corporate reforms, legal investigations, cultural shifts, and most meaningfully, the individual lives touched and changed along the way. He had never set out to be a symbol or to create a movement. He had simply made the choice his conscience demanded when confronted with injustice. And perhaps that was the most important lesson of all, that change often begins not with grand strategies or noble intentions, but with one person in one moment simply refusing to look away when principle is at stake. The call for dignity and respect that had been issued on Flight 3117 continued to echo, carried forward by countless others who had found their own voices and courage through his example. And while Thomas Richards had returned to the cockpit, he loved the true legacy of his stand was flying far beyond any destination he had ever charted. Welcome aboard indeed. And that's the story of Flight 3117, the day Captain Thomas Richards chose integrity over convenience and changed an entire industry in the process. When Thomas refused to allow Vanessa Blackwell's racist behavior on his aircraft, he couldn't have known that his decision would topple a corrupt financial empire, transform airline policies, and inspire countless others to find their own courage. He simply knew that in that crucial moment he had to stand for what was right. What would you have done in his position? Would you have risked your career of 30 years to defend a stranger's dignity? Or would you have looked the other way to protect your livelihood? These aren't easy questions, and there's no shame in acknowledging how difficult such choices can be. The power of Thomas's story lies not just in his initial decision, but in how that single moment of principle created ripples that continued to spread long after Flight 317 landed. One person's courage inspired others to find their voice. Dr. Jackson established a foundation. Sophia Rodriguez rose to leadership. Even James Wilson, who initially chose fear over principle, eventually found his way to a better path. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up against injustice when it would have been easier to remain silent? Maybe you've been that person yourself, facing consequences for doing what you believed was right. Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The truth is, we may never know the full impact of our actions when we choose to stand against wrong. Thomas didn't set out to bring down Richard Blackwell or create industry-wide reforms. He simply refused to let a child be humiliated on his aircraft. Yet that decision created a chain reaction that brought long overdue accountability to those who had considered themselves beyond reach. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that one person's principles can still matter in today's world. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories of justice served and lives transformed. And remember Thomas's words to the young pilots he mentored: "The uniform gives us authority, but our actions give us moral authority." In your own life, in your own moments of decision, may you find the courage to stand tall when it matters most. Until next time, this is Real Life Drama, bringing you stories that remind us of our shared humanity and the power of everyday courage. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear this powerful message, and click the notification bell so you never miss our next inspiring story.